Restoration on the Half Shell. We really appreciate you being here. My name is Jimmy Frederick. I'm the Communications Director for the Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. And we're going to have a lot of great fun today, and we appreciate you being here. We're also going to be talking a lot about our coastal land loss crisis. But the main thing that we want you to take away from here is that we are really working. We're thinking about the future, and we're working toward ensuring that coastal Louisiana is here for many, many generations to come, so that we can work and play and live and enjoy the coast that we enjoy now, but our children, grandchildren, and many generations past that can do the same thing. A couple of things for how the day is going to run, the morning is going to run. We're going to have 4 great presentations that you will really get a lot out of. But we don't want you to be shy, and we want you to make sure that you engage in the discussions, you ask questions if you have them. The presentations will last about 15 minutes each or so, and then we'll have some time afterwards for you to ask questions. We're also going to have a wonderful panel coming up after the morning break at 10:30. And we want you to enjoy the conference. And I should have started off with this. This is part of the State of the Coast Conference. And the State of the Coast, this is our 5th iteration of this conference. It happens every 2 years. We have approximately 1,200 scientists, engineers, landowners, resource managers, local, state, and federal officials, decision makers, and business leaders that are here to exchange ideas, to discuss their research, and as important as all that is in our breakout sessions, the conversations on the sidelines are just as important. It's the collaboration that we find going on in the coffee breaks and over lunch and over dinner that really make this conference exceptional. And we certainly appreciate the fact that y'all are here. This is going to be a little less technical than the stuff you would see in the breakout rooms, but it's still going to be very useful information for you. We want you to enjoy the conference, so when we go at our coffee break, please come into the exhibit hall, check out all the great things that are going on in there, and just know that you're a part of this conference just like everybody else is, and we appreciate that. First, I'm going to read just a quick, this Restoration on the Half Shell is brought to you by 3 wonderful sponsors. Our presenting sponsor is Chevron. I just want to read a little something that they sent. They wanted to make sure that you guys all understand how important the coastal... Participants, please stand up. There's the ones going to have to make sure that we have our coast into the future. Thank you, guys. Great job. All right, now we're going to try something different and new for me. I need you to take out your cell phones. No, don't normally ask people to do that. But we're going to try we're going to do a polling exercise where you are going to use your phone to text to 22333. And we're going to ask you to text the code next to the answer that corresponds to where did you travel here from. Terrible English. So somebody's from NOLA, so if you'll just text in where you're from New Orleans, outside of the New Orleans, but the greater New Orleans area, Central, West, North Louisiana, out of state, all right. What's that? Down the road? That's close. So we're going to do this for a couple, this is just a little icebreaker, so we're going to do this for a few more questions. We're going to get into some coastal things. And I got to be honest, Corey Miller told me this was going to work, and so far it is, and I appreciate that. One other thing that I need to mention, and I failed to do that, the State of the Coast is a partnership between the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, the Water Institute of the Gulf, and CRCL. It's very important. Those 3 partners have worked very well to make this happen. All right, let's check out all right, so we have about a third from New Orleans, about a quarter from in the greater New Orleans area, around Central, West, and North Louisiana, and then, look at that, some from out of state. We appreciate y'all being here. All right, let's check out the next question. All right, approximately how many people live along Louisiana's coast? Same thing, 22333, and then is it 700,000, 1 million, 2 million, or 4 million? Sorry. So what's the correct answer? Oh, somebody's going after it. battle. I like this. 69% saying 2 million. Give it another couple of seconds here. And the correct answer is 2 million. So very good for 56%. Oh, you're getting in on the, after I said it. Nice. You'll see on the next slide that, there are 4 million people basically in the state of Louisiana, and 2 million of them live in the coastal zone. And you'll see each one of these red dots equals 100,000 people. 100 people. I could have read it. And that's 2 million people. That's a lot of people, not only that live in coastal Louisiana, but work and play, and that's not including all the people that come from all over the state and all over the country to enjoy South Louisiana. Our next question is, again, 22333. What percentage of the U.S. does the Mississippi River drain? Now, this could be a little tougher. 31%, 41%, 51%, or 61%. The Mississippi River, a lifeline for our economy. This is a tricky one. Back and forth, back and forth. Who's going to get the right answer? We'll give it another 2 seconds or so. 34% say 51%, 34% say 61%. 41's climbing, and 41 is the winner, actually. 41% of the United States is drained by the Mississippi River Basin. And this is a great graphic coming up. See, we're learning this stuff as well. There it is. Look at the Mississippi River in pink. All that drains down the Mississippi River Basin. It's 33 states in one province of Canada. That's how important the Mississippi River is to the United States and, quite frankly, to the world. All right, last question for this, and we're going to get to the great presentations we have for you. Approximately how much land in coastal Louisiana has been lost since the 1930s? 22333. No land has been lost. If you're here, you know that's not the right answer. 1,250 square miles, 1,880 square miles, or 4,100 square miles? 45% say 1,880, 4,100, 49%. There's a battle for who's going to win. And the last couple of seconds here, it is right at approximately 1,880 square miles, 1,900 square miles, the size of Delaware we have lost since the 1930s. So, just a quick little exercise. I've got to hand it to you. I really didn't think it was going to work. Y'all are awesome. Y'all are awesome. I tried to convince Corey not to do this, and I was completely wrong. So, our first presentation is it's called A Strategy to Combat Our Land Loss Crisis. Dr. Alisha Renfro from the National Wildlife Federation is going to present, and Alisha, take it away.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Good morning. So I'm glad that the polling worked. There's a few of the questions in that are actually quite relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. So here we have a snapshot of the coast of Louisiana. Very stylized, very pretty. This is a coastline that didn't look like this 50 years ago and isn't going to look like this 50 years from now. One thing I want you to note is, and I'm going to show you a series of slides coming up, is that we have 4 stars. This is Lafayette, approximately, Baton Rouge, Houma, and New Orleans. So this is a coast that has been modified over time. And on this slide, you can see that there's a lot of red here. These represent levees, either levees along the river or levees that surround communities for hurricane protection. So 8,000 years ago, this is what the coastline looked like. It's very different. But we have the 41% of the U.S. is drained by the Mississippi River, and over time, land was built. So the sediment coming from as far north as Canada and water coming, from Minnesota all came down and was dumped into the Gulf of Mexico, leaving behind thousands of acres of wetlands. And over time, the river would find a more efficient route to the Gulf and start to move. So kind of like a fire hose, the river moved back and forth across the coast and built South Louisiana and the Mississippi River Delta. Now, one thing you might note from here is that we have a lot of channels that branch off of here. Well, we talk about the Mississippi River. It's the Mississippi River, and it's also distributary channels that branch off the river that help distribute that flow. But this isn't what the system looks like today. This is what it looks like today. So how did we get here? So when the Europeans first arrived in this area, they found an area that was rich, teeming with life, buffalo, rich soils for growing, and they wanted to live here. They wanted to make their lives here. But they also ran into a problem. They had this mighty Mississippi River that would overflow its banks from time to time and destroy all their hard work. So pretty quickly, pretty much as soon as the European settlers started coming in, they started building levees along the river. And in fact, it was kind of a requirement if you were given land by the King of France to build these river levees. So very soon, levees stretched all the way up to Baton Rouge. But they weren't really good levees. They were pretty bad at making the levees because there was no consistency. It was up to the individual landowner to make a levee, and so the river broke through those levees pretty frequently. And over here, what we have is a map showing all the places the river broke through during a certain period of time. So these things called crevasses, when the river was high, the water would find a weak spot in the levee and go through. Now, one of the last ones that actually had a big impact in New Orleans was called, I'm just going to pronounce it Sauvé. I don't know if that's quite right. The Sauvé's crevasse. And this was a sugar plantation in Jefferson Parish. The river broke through the levee during a high flow, and it flooded all the way down to Canal Street. So this is a painting depicting the flooding on Canal Street from that crevasse. But we got a little smarter, we got a little wiser. How are we going to live with the river? How are we going to manage this better? And the federal government stepped in and started having standards for levees. And that was all well and good until the 1927 flood, and that really highlighted that this idea of levees only as a way to manage the river was not going to work for the long term. So what we have here, this is a map, and everything you see that's shaded, that's what flooded during the 1927 flood. So lots of the area flooded, and it was pretty widespread. We have Little Rock, Arkansas, where a bridge was washed out. Greenville, Mississippi. Morgan City, Louisiana. And you'll notice right here around New Orleans, there isn't flooding, but there is south of New Orleans. So that's because they blew the levee at Carnarvon, just below New Orleans. This was done because the waters were getting higher and higher in New Orleans. People started to panic, and they pressured, and pressure was put to blow the levees to relieve the pressure against the New Orleans levees. So that area was blown up, and it did displace a lot of people. Overall, the 1927 flood killed 500 people, destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes, and displaced more than 1 million people. This was a devastating flood of record for our country, and really drove home the point that we actually have to think about the river in a different way. So from that comes what's called the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project. The Congress authorized the Army Corps of Engineers to come up with a way to manage the river better. We had a levees-only policy up until this point, and this kind of changes the game. So it does have levees, improved flood walls, bigger, better levees. It also has channel improvements and stabilizations, those rock revetments along the levees, cutting off some of the bends in the river that helped navigation continue on. Then you also have tributary basin improvements, putting in reservoirs that can hold back floodwaters so they can control when floods come down a little bit better. And then finally, building in floodways, allowing places where water can have a relief, have that where we blew the levee at Carnarvon before, actually building something in place where you can have that relief from the floodwaters. And in terms of floodways, there are 4 major ones as part of the MR&T, and 3 of them are in Louisiana. There's one up here just south of Cairo, Illinois, called the Bird Point or New Madrid Floodway. Then there's the Atchafalaya, Morganza, and then of course there's the Bonnie Carey spillway, which was operated this year in order to alleviate flood pressure on the levees for New Orleans. But the MRNT system also had another consequence. When we put up all these levees, when we tried to manage the flow, we cut off a lot of where the sediment and freshwater once went. We cut off all those distributary channels. There are barely any distributary channels for the river anymore. And in fact, the only major one left is the Atchafalaya River. And this, oh, that's right, I overthought myself. Sometimes I am clever. Put little circles around things so I don't have to use the pointer. So we have, you can see where brown plumes of sediment are coming out. This is from the 2011 flood, which was a big flood on the river that was managed very successfully. It was a very big flood, and the Corps did a good job of managing this flood. They did actually use the Morganza spillway, and as you can see from this image, they used the Bonnie Carey spillway as well. So you have a lot of sediment coming out of the river, and a lot of it is going into the Gulf, not going into the places where it's most needed. So there's also lots of other changes that we've done to the system. You know, people, we have a great ability to come in and modify our environment to our own liking, and sometimes it has unintended consequences. And some of these things are just natural consequence of where we live and the other processes that are happening. You have things like sea level rise. Sea levels are rising. Dams upriver, particularly along the Missouri, have decreased the amount of sediment that actually makes its way down to Louisiana. You have the introduction of invasive species, things like nutria or some of the feral hogs that will tear up the marsh itself. You have subsidence. The geology of Louisiana is one where we are sinking, whether that's happening in the deep, deep geology or that's happening at the surface, because we have wet, muddy sediment on top of wet, muddy sediment, and it squeezes out over time and we sink. You also have oil and gas infrastructure that have been carved through the wetlands that have changed and disrupted how salt and fresh water flow through the system. Navigation channels like the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which was dredged in the 50s and 60s as a shortcut from the Gulf of Mexico to the Port of New Orleans. It was not really heavily used, but it did help serve as a saltwater superhighway up into the freshwater wetlands along the eastern flank of the city. And that's the vulnerable flank of the city as exposed in Hurricane Katrina. Then you also have oil spills, large man-made oil spills that can smother the marsh vegetation and impact the organisms that live there. And then of course you have hurricanes. Hurricanes which shape our communities, change where people live, change how people live within the coast. So all of these things together have had a result: widespread land loss across Louisiana. And from our quiz, how many square miles have we lost? Yep, we lost nearly 2,000 square miles. That's 5,000 square kilometers if you like metric. So, and you know, I just had this pointed out to me last night. If you are red-green colorblind, all of this is red. There's only green here and here. So, just a note. In the future, I'll have to remember that. So we've had a lot of land loss. And what has that land loss meant? It means that the estuaries that are some of our most productive environments are changing. You're losing the land that is habitat for a lot of organisms. You also have salt water moving into freshwater systems, changing who and what can live there. And an estuary is defined by a mix of fresh and salt water. It's an environment where fresh and salt water mix. You have a gradient of salinities from freshwater to saltwater where organisms can come in and find the perfect place for them to not only survive but thrive. Everyone can find where it is they need to be and where their predators aren't. So estuaries are kind of the backbone for productivity in the Gulf of Mexico. Widespread land loss has meant a lot for communities as well. I'm going to just zoom in here on New Orleans. You can see we've had a lot of land loss along that eastern flank of New Orleans. It wasn't that long ago where the Gulf of Mexico was pretty far from New Orleans. Every day it gets a little bit closer. And that point was driven home during Hurricane Katrina, when that eastern flank of the city was exposed and we had widespread flooding in the city. And what we can actually see, if we look, this is a map of flooding in Katrina going from 0.2 feet up to, I think, 15 feet. You can actually see a reflection of how this system or how this area was built. You have the sliver along the river here, which is the natural river levee. It's the high ground of the city. It's where we are right now. You also see some high ground spots here, and these are old bayous, Bayou Gentilly and Bayou Metairie. So again, the high ground. And then you have a lot of areas that are below sea level now. A lot of this was swampland that's been drained. And so that is where the water accumulated during Hurricane Katrina. So the coast has changed, and a lot of places, when they talk about their coastlines, they'll talk about how change is coming. Things are going to change. Here in Louisiana, change has been happening for a very long time. And it isn't going to stop. It's going to continue to change. So I'm just going to give you a preview of this. I think I might show this map one or two times. But this could be what our future looks like if we don't do restoration. And again, everything in red is loss, and everything in green is gain. So it's a future defined by loss. And this is a scary future, and it's a future that I think doesn't help any of us. So what can we do? Well, first, we need to start thinking about our coast in a different way. And this was really something I think the 2005 hurricane season made a good point of. We can't just think of levees. We can't put our faith in levees alone. They're not enough. Levees can fail, and then we're trapped in a city filled with water. We actually have to think about how all the pieces we have at our disposal can work together for a better, more sustainable future. And that means non-structural adaptation. This is things like elevating homes, flood-proofing businesses. You can live in the areas where the elevation is lower, but you're gonna have to think about, how do I get above the base flood elevation? How do I protect my home better? We also do have things like structural protection, levees, elevated roads. How do we protect our communities? How do we get access to the things that we need to get access to? But it's also about integrating environmental restoration. Having a strong and healthy coastline in front of those levees is really important. Those natural environments, the bare islands, intact marshes, can help slow that storm surge down before it even gets to our levees. So having all these things together will create a better, more resilient future for our coastal communities. So this could be our future if we do nothing. Now, we can just let that happen. We can just let nature do what it's going to do and see what we're dealt, or we can be proactive and we can decide that we have some power in our future and we can do something to change this. And the state of Louisiana has decided, yes, we do have the power to change this. We have to be smart about it, though. We don't have all the money in the world, and we're not going to get all the money in the world. So we have to take whatever dollars we can get and invest it in the best way possible. And the state has done this by going through a coastal master plan process to understand how we build a better coast for Louisiana, for our communities, for the organisms that live here, the places that we like to hunt and fish. And this is kind of the embodiment or the backbone of the master plan. This is what we've decided. Here's how we think we should spend our money moving forward. Here's what coastal restoration looks like in Louisiana. And this is cutting edge. Other places don't have this. When Hurricane Sandy hit New York, they looked towards Louisiana and said, oh, that's a good idea. We should start doing that as well. So it's one of the things that I think Louisiana should be proud of, that we're a little bit ahead of the game, and now we just have to implement it. And Brent is actually going to talk a little bit more about the coastal master plan process and how we got to this level that we are here.
We have some questions. If we have any questions, got a minute for questions. We got plenty of time. We've got some 5 minutes for questions. Then we're going to have a video, and then we're going to bring up the one and only Brent Haas.
All right, I jumped it, I guess. Yeah. I think it's something, there's been a few studies that have tried to look at it, but I don't know. I've never tried to look at all of the data to see, can you actually zero in on like how much any one thing contributed to land loss. I think that's a complicated thing. It may be there, but I don't know the data enough to know that. Mm-hmm.
Has there been any research associated with the possibility of taking the river water and putting it back into any of the original remaining tributaries, particularly like Bayou Lafourche, Bayou Terrebonne, Bayou Penchant, and all of those, I think almost all of them are in historic rivers, but they're all no longer flowing because we don't get the water anymore.
Yeah, there's actually a project that will is looking to increase the flow in Bayou Lafourche. They are trying to put more water back in it. It is something that is being looked at and has been explored a little bit more. I think, you know, having that natural distributary network and using that to our advantage is a good way to go about it. In terms of like putting the sediment and water back into the area in general, there are some restoration projects that are being looked at and have a lot of science behind them. That have been presented on sediment diversions and freshwater diversions. Some of them use the old distributary channels, but some of them are creating a new channel to kind of reconnect the river with those wetland areas. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are you going to talk about that at all? Okay. So I'll just answer quick. So in general, the coastal master plan process, they update the plan every 5 years, and they will try and use the latest science. So they do try to use, when they start the process, the most up-to-date predictions of what sea level rise is going to look like. And so that is a variable that changes over time, and it is one of the reasons why the master plan is a living document that gets updated. Our conditions change, whether we have hurricanes, the rate of sea level rise changes, and so we have to be somewhat flexible and adaptable in that. So they do try and actually take that into account. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry. So what is it?
To what extent is the old science that existed in the
Mm-hmm.
to what extent is that being practiced?
That I don't know.
Here, let's,
Okay.
I'm sorry. I asked, to what extent is the science that existed in indigenous peoples who were here first, to what extent is that being factored in to the new plan, the new technologies?
Yeah. Yeah, traditional ecological knowledge. Yeah. I think it's something that we are trying to figure out as we move forward, and I think that's a good question, and I don't know the full extent of it, but that's a very good question. Okay.
I can help.
Okay.
So I'm Brent Hawes. I'm with CPRA, and we have had a pilot program to incorporate something called SciTech, traditional ecological knowledge, which is exactly what you're talking about, into the evaluation tools that we use to look at projects and in the future of the coast as well. So to that extent, now it's been small scale, it's not been very wide scale, but we certainly recognize that as a valuable knowledge base and something that we need to incorporate into our work and what's going to occur in the future along our coast. So we hope to expand that and certainly incorporate more of that tech into what we're doing. Absolutely.
thank you, Dr. Alisha Renfro. Great job. One of the other things we wanted to do with Restoration on the Half Shell is bring in some of the other community organizations that are involved in restoration. And one of them is the Coastal Communities Consulting. And we have a quick little video just with Sandy Wynn, who's going to tell you a little bit more about the organization.
Coastal Communities Consulting is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that services coastal entrepreneurs in Southeast Louisiana through 4 focus areas, which is business technical assistance, social service, economic development, and continued disaster assistance. Our mission is to secure coastal communities' resilience by developing transitional mechanisms to support businesses and families on the front line of ecological, climate, and policy changes. I think the first thing and the most important thing is to have everybody understand and be aware that I live in New Orleans East, but I'm considered a coastal city. 30, 40 years ago, you know, a lot of my fishermen, my American generational fishermen, always talk about how they cry for coastal restoration. They've seen the land loss, right? They're there. But typically they're not included in the conversations, right? And so, and it's been going on too long. The restoration projects, process, policy, it all will affect and impact all of our coastal entrepreneurs, their business as well as their family. Outreach and knowledge has to continue until they get it. But we need to have just residents in general understand, first and foremost, before they can even think, plan, or engage.
That was Sandy Wynn. Now it's time for Mr. Brent Haas with the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, a master plan and its implementation. Brent?
All right, thank y'all. I am Brent Haas. I work for the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, as you've heard, I guess, 3 times now. I am the chief of our planning and research division, and among other things, one of the things that we're responsible for is for developing this master plan that we're talking about here today. And so, really appreciate the introductions. I appreciate the way Alisha set the table for us. I think it's really, really important. One of the things that she highlighted was the red maps, right? The map of what our future might look like in the future. And you know, I think it's really important for any conversation about our coast to start with that. And to be honest with you, those of us in the business, if you will, sort of take that for granted, that everybody's aware of what our future coast might look like, because we see it so much. We work with it day in and day out. But you really can't have a conversation about our coast unless you take a look at that map and really think about what it means to our coast. Louisiana is facing an existential crisis. It's a crisis of land loss, and it absolutely sets the context within which that we have to have these conversations. So, but I do want to show you something maybe in a little bit of a different way. It's a similar concept, I guess. This is an aerial photograph of our coast, essentially as it is today, and you can see the land mass that's there. It looks like there's quite a lot. But if you think about the map that Alisha showed that had the dots on it, right, where people were living, it was along the ridges and it was in some very isolated areas along really this map. And so if you take away the areas on this map where if you walked on it you'd get your feet wet, this is what coastal Louisiana really looks like. This is where we live. This is where our farms are. This is where our cities are. And it's important to note that much of this is below sea level now because it's behind levees. So anyway, just a little bit of a different way to think about that, and again, kind of set the context for what we're talking about. So we at CPRA are a relatively new organization. We've not been around all that long. Really, the hurricane season of 2005 was the moment in time when folks realized that Louisiana really wasn't conducting its business in a very wise manner. We had one group of state government dealing with risk reduction, levees, flood walls, that kind of stuff, and another group of state government dealing with ecosystem restoration and trying to restore our coast. And quite frankly, we didn't really know each other existed. We didn't talk to each other. The two things weren't integrated. And again, that hurricane season of 2005 that was so devastating for this part of the state and really the whole state, out southwest and central as well, was the moment in time when folks realized, you know, we really need to be doing this, thinking about this issue and these problems in a much, much better way. And these two things need to be integrated. They're very much intertwined. A healthy, resilient coast, obviously, is very important to our risk reduction system. We mentioned the multiple lines of defense, Alisha did just a minute ago. And so our risk reduction system needs that healthy coast. And if we're well protected, living in a city like New Orleans or Houma or wherever that may be, obviously, one of the reasons we like to live here is because of those natural resources and an ecosystem that's so close, so accessible, and that provides so much to us from an economical, recreational, and you know, spiritual even aspect. So the two things really are integrated. And again, in that. After that hurricane season of 2005, luckily our state leadership decided that we needed to have an organization that would be able to plan for our future and manage that future rather than have that changing coast sort of dictate its will on us into the future, and that was the impetus for the creation of CPRA. And they told us in our formation that we want you to develop this master plan. We want you to plan, implement, and enforce a master plan for sustainable coastal Louisiana. And so that's what we've done. I'm asked a lot, really, what the master plan is. And to me, it's really two things. And I'll step back before I mention what those two things are. And the first thing I'll say is, I think if you're here, you understand that Louisiana's in a complicated place. Our coast is a complicated place, right? It's very dynamic. It changes year to year. It can change day to day. And if we have a large hurricane event, right, in the span of 24 hours, it can change drastically. We think sea levels are rising. The future is uncertain in terms of what might happen. We alluded to that a little bit earlier. We've got a large-scale problem. We need to have large-scale solutions. It's been a long-term problem. We need long-term solutions. And so you've got all of this in the mix in trying to figure out what is the best thing that we can do for our coast. And so the master plan, the first thing I think that it is really is a way, it's a process for wading through, taking into all those factors and trying to figure out what's the best thing to do for our coast as a whole. And then secondly, it's a list of projects. It's a list of projects that are prioritized that, again, we think can do the most good for our coast. The master plan is updated every 5 years. Alisha referred to that as well. And again, that's for good reason, I think, and was a wise decision that our legislature made when they formed CPRA and asked us to develop the plan, because that coast is changing. And I think it would be foolish to develop a plan in 2007, for example, when the first plan was put out, to assume that that plan would really be valid 50 years out or 100 years out. Because things change so much along our coast. And so we do take a reevaluate and redo the plan. So far it's been every 5 years. That's actually changed in this legislative session. It will now be every 6 years, so the next plan won't come out until 2023. But the first plan, as you see, was developed in 2007. And again, that was really in response to the hurricane season 2 years before that. And it was very much a look at our coast and an attempt to articulate what we would do if we could do everything we would want to do for our coast at that point in time. And it was great. It was the first time in the history of the United States that both risk reduction and restoration had been integrated. Again, something that Louisiana is leading the way in, something that we're very proud of. Other parts of the country are looking to us to do this kind of work. But we quickly realized as we moved to 2012 and began to thinking about the update that that might not be the best way to look at our coast. And the reason I say that is if you put a price tag on everything that was listed in that 2007 plan, you'd be looking at 250 to 300 billion with a B, dollars worth of work. That's a tremendous amount of work. And we don't think, frankly, to be blunt, that it's realistic that Louisiana will generate or receive that kind of funding to do this kind of work over even a 50-year period. And so in 2012, we rethought things a little bit, and we said, okay, what do we know there's some real constraints, some real world constraints, right? We all live with a financial, or most of us do anyway. I won't speak for you, but I certainly live with financial constraints day to day. I can't spend all the money that I don't have. And so there's similar constraints as it relates to restoring our coast and protecting our citizens. Money obviously is a key one of those, but there are also some real natural resource constraints like freshwater, sediment, nutrients, and those kind of things. And so for the 2012 plan, we developed this process, again, of making these hard decisions in this sort of complex environment with constraints, what we think are realistic constraints in terms of funding and natural resources for what are the best things for our coast. So that was a big difference between 2007 and 2012. We really took the same approach in 2017, and some of the major advances really between 2012 and 2017 were to improve the science and the knowledge base behind some of the decisions that are made as part of the master plan. And also, we at CPRA don't think we have all the right answers. We don't know everything there is to know about the coast, certainly, and so we put a call out to the public. We mentioned the traditional ecological knowledge. We said, hey, you guys live on the coast, and what do you think it is that we need to be looking at and evaluating to help ensure a sustainable coastal Louisiana in the future? And so that was done in 2017. And so, in a very tight nutshell, this is it. This is the master plan. So this is a map that shows all of the various projects that are included in the 2017 master plan. There are 124 of those projects. We believe those projects can deliver about 800 square miles of land that we wouldn't otherwise have without the projects in place. And we believe that it can reduce flood damage across the coast by about $150 billion. I should mention, and I didn't earlier, I guess, but the master plan both in 2012 and 2017 were, you may have heard, $50 billion 50-year plans. So that was the funding constraint that was used to develop the plan. So certainly we could use much more than $50 billion, as I mentioned earlier. The 2007 plan was $300 billion essentially. So, but we think that $50 billion range is roughly what's plausible that we may be able to generate and come to the state over the next 50 years or so. So you see there are a number of different project types here. There's, of course, structural risk reduction projects, and those are things that we're pretty familiar with. There's levees. We're within a stone's throw of a levee right here, but levees, floodgates, flood walls, those kinds of things. There are also non-structural projects, and that's a little bit of a misnomer, really, but what we're talking about there is risk reduction mitigation actions that are not traditional, like levees and stuff. So it's elevation of homes, floodproofing of businesses, for example, and acquisition of structures as well on a voluntary basis, of course. There are ridge restoration projects. That's again one of those one of the many multiple lines of defense that we discussed earlier. Shoreline protection projects, barrier island restoration projects, marsh restoration projects where we dredge sediment and place that in an area that's perhaps open water right now to create marshes. Sediment diversions, obviously we want to harness those natural processes that help build coastal Louisiana in the first place. We know the river built much of southeast Louisiana. It makes sense to try to tap into that resource to try to help restore what we've got, and then also hydrologic restoration projects where we're trying to restore some of the natural hydrology, the way water and sediment and so forth moves along our coast. So one of the benefits, I guess, of all this work, and I'll get into some of the work that's occurring now and will occur in the very near future, is that Louisiana, you know, we mentioned Louisiana's kind of leading the way in this arena, this sort of integrated hazard mitigation, environmental restoration, you know, sector. And so we're creating an economy. We're creating an economy for coastal Louisiana. And you can see some of the numbers here in terms of almost 11,000 jobs potentially being created annually with relatively high average wages and value added to the state economy, you know, pushing $800 million annually. Not only is this good for Louisiana, obviously, in terms of economic value, but we're developing this knowledge base, we're developing this workforce, if you will, that are dealing with these issues that we know other places are already dealing with in our country. We mentioned Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast and a lot of the expertise that went to assist them, but other places around the country, Miami, San Francisco, and indeed around the world, that are going to be looking to this kind of these kind of solutions and dealing with these kind of issues that we're already dealing with here in Louisiana. So it's really an economic sector that we believe is exportable. So talked a little bit about the plan very briefly, but I want to let you know that there is an awful lot going on already. Since CPRA's inception, roughly a decade or so ago, about $20 billion has been secured for coastal Louisiana. Much of that is related to the work that's gone on, risk reduction work that's gone on right here in the greater New Orleans area. But a lot of that has occurred across the state as well and includes ecosystem restoration type projects. Mentioned dredging projects for creating ridges, marshes, and barrier islands and so forth. About 130 million cubic yards of sediment has been dredged. So I don't know about you, 130 million cubic yards doesn't mean a whole lot to me, but I'll tell you that's the equivalent of about 23 to 24 Superdomes worth of sediment. All of that's been dredged, much of it from the river or from offshore, brought onto our coast, again, to help build our coastal ecosystems. That's benefited about 41,000 acres of our coastal wetlands. Over 297 miles of levees have either been built or improved since that about 2007 timeframe, and roughly 60 miles of our barrier islands and shorelines have been rebuilt or restored in that time. So lots going on. And so I wanted to touch a little bit on, I guess, the mechanism of how work occurs, right? So we've got the master plan. It's kind of the high-level, long-term view of what we think is good for the coast. But then we've got the day-to-day business of how do you get that done? How do you implement that master plan? And the mechanism that we use for implementing that plan really it's an annual plan. And that's just what it sounds like. It's a yearly plan that describes what we think the revenues, essentially, or the money coming in to the state and to CPRA will accomplish and how we intend to spend those dollars. Now, I'll touch on it briefly. I'll let you know that funding at CPRA is a very complicated thing. There's numerous sources of funds. I'll tell you right off the bat, we don't receive any state general funds. There is a relatively small trust fund that's associated with oil and gas royalties that helps fund some of our operation. But much of the funding that we're working with right now really is a result of the oil spill that occurred in 2010. And all of those funding streams have strings attached, if you will. So there are three major funding streams associated with the oil spill. There's the Restore Act funds. Those are administered by a Restore Council. And most of those funds are required to be spent on restoration projects. There are the criminal funds associated with the oil spill that are come through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. In Louisiana, those funds are required to be spent on river diversions or barrier islands. That's all we can spend those dollars on. And then there are the what am I missing? NERDA, sorry, Natural Resources Damage Assessment Funds, which are required to essentially mitigate for harm realized by the state as a result of the oil spill. All of those dollars have to be spent on restoration type projects as well. Another major source of funding that we get is from GOMESA. You may have heard of that, the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, and it's a royalty sharing program essentially with the federal government where some money comes to the state depending on oil production from offshore oil and gas. Those dollars can be spent on a wide variety of things actually, but because of the amount of money that's being spent on restoration, CPRA has basically made the decision that those dollars will be expended on risk reduction type projects. So I know that was complicated. That's a lot to take in right now, but all of that's spelled out essentially in our annual plan, which is what I wanted to get to anyway. But I just wanted you to understand a little bit of the complexity of the funding that has come to the state. I also want to mention that we hear about the BP settlement and that it's a multi-billion-dollar settlement. You hear different numbers. About $8 billion is about the right figure. I want you to know that Louisiana and CPRA is not sitting on a bank account that has $8 billion in it right now. Those dollars come to the state over time, over a 15-year period. And so much of the work we do, we have to front actually the funding for, and then apply for grants and so forth to essentially reimburse ourselves. So it's very, very much a cash flow kind of a situation as you think about the funding for CPRA. Nevertheless, I do want to let you know again. So this is a breakdown essentially of the FY18 annual plan. Again, this is where we let the public know here's the money that we expect to get over this next year, and here's the money that we expect to spend and how we expect to expend it. So you can see a total here of $644 million. That's been about average for the last few years. That's what we anticipate expending, and it ranges on any number of projects: planning, engineering and design, construction, operation and maintenance, and we have a little bit of operating costs in there as well. So, but I really just wanted to touch on kind of the range of expected expenditures, and that those expenditures are going up over time. So in 19, they actually go down a little bit to a little over $500 million. 2020, they jump up to close to $1 billion, which is really where we need to be with a $50 billion 50-year plan, right? We need to be spending about $1 billion a year to accomplish our goals. And then looking out into 2021, about 800, and that's all I had right there. But I'm not done. So I want to let you know, and I think there'll be some discussion about this a little later on about how to get involved. So, another thing I want to make sure I leave you with here is both through the master planning process, which is a much longer term and again kind of higher level, higher scale planning effort, and through the annual plan process. There are numerous opportunities to meet with us individually, CPRA individually, and numerous opportunities like this, public meeting type settings for folks' voices to be heard. So all of these things are put out as drafts. You guys are allowed to or have the opportunity to review those, develop questions, ask us, hey, why are you spending money here and not here? Why are you doing this project and not this project, and so forth, and provide those comments to us. Which we do take seriously. We made some pretty substantive changes to the master plan, for example, as a result of public comment. And then both of those plans have to be passed through our state legislature. So there's another, obviously, opportunity for folks to get involved and speak with their legislators about what they do or don't like with any of these plans and get involved. So I'm gonna end there. I think I'm. Am I out of time?
You have 4 minutes to take questions.
All right, I got 4 minutes worth of questions.
4 minutes.
So yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. I really appreciate your attention and yeah, this big crowd here today. This is great. Thank you.
In the back, and speak up if I don't get to you with the microphone.
Hey, I'm just curious about a definition. Alisha talked about we've lost almost 2,000 square miles of land, and then you talked about how we're going to be building 802 square miles of land, and you also showed the map of dry land.
Yeah.
So when you're saying land,
Yeah.
are you talking about any like marsh and things like that, or is it dry land? Because I think
Well,
that's a very important.
Yeah, so when we're
thing to
talking about
communicate.
restoring land at CPRA, we're talking about restoring wetlands.
Okay,
some
so-
marshes, swamps, there's some ridges in there, and depending on who you ask, those are wetlands or not. But yeah, by and large, we're talking about marshes and
I think
swamps.
that's an important
It
communication thing, because we aren't. Yeah, anyway, it's.
No, it very
it's
much
very
is. I
important.
appreciate you pointing that out. That's one of those traps that I tend to fall in. So thank you.
Somebody up front.
Graphics earlier about, with the showing how the watershed built the coast.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how are we engaging all of Louisiana to help build the coast around the watershed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things that I didn't touch on is the fact that, while we're in New Orleans, right, we're in a coastal city, and this is a coastal issue. It very much is not just a coastal issue. It's an issue for all of Louisiana. It's an issue for all of the Gulf Coast, indeed all of the country. When you talk about food production, national security, energy production, transportation, that's why New Orleans is here in the first place, right, because of the river and the transportation and national security benefits that it provides. And so generally, whenever we speak in a group like this, we absolutely touch on those kind of things. And so we have a traveling show, if you will, and we travel all over the state to sort of spread this message. I've been to Shreveport, Monroe, Alexandria, you name it, and other parts of the country as well. And so if you look at any of our documentation, any of our materials on our website, they generally start with, why is this important? Why should it be important to you, Mr. Midwest farmer? Why should it be important to you that lives in, Seattle or wherever it may be? So, we've got a lot of materials, I guess, emphasizing the importance of coastal Louisiana, again, regionally and nationally. And we, our strategy is to, beat that drum as loud and as hard as we possibly can whenever we can.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I had some questions about the jobs you said would be created through these efforts. So I know oftentimes there are jobs that are created, but they don't go to local communities, and they're not necessarily like jobs that contribute to the green economy.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, are there any strategies in plan to make sure that the jobs are going to folk in Louisiana? And also considering there's a gendered wage gap, like what are we doing to ensure that that wage is actually, received by men and women?
Sure. Yeah. So, obviously we are bound by state law, obviously, as we all are, in terms of how projects are bid out and so forth. But we have taken a very proactive stance in terms of trying to connect local contractors with contractors that perhaps aren't local, to ensure that they're hiring local workforces, and where we can, that local contractors that are able to bid again and work on these projects. So we do everything we can within our power, again, sort of within the limit of the law, which is a little bit restrictive, as you probably know. But we've certainly recognized these are important issues, and as you said, with the amount of money that may be associated with some of these projects, you're talking about $1 billion+ projects. We want to make sure that a lot of those dollars are staying here in Louisiana. Absolutely.
We have one last question from one of our 300 students, Brent.
What is the timeline for completing most of your major coastal projects in Lower Plaquemines Parish?
Oh, that's a good question. So there are a lot of projects in Lower Plaquemines Parish, and so I'm going to assume maybe that you're referring to the diversion projects, or 2 diversion projects planned in Plaquemines Parish that are big projects, cornerstone projects of the master plan, and they're on a timeline of roughly 3 to 4 years for starting construction on those.
Great. Thanks so much, Brent. We appreciate it very much. We'll probably have some more time for Brent a little later.
Thank
Thanks,
y'all.
Brent. We have one more presentation before we get to break, but we're going to show another quick video. This is from the Lower 9 Center for Sustainable Development and Engagement.
CSCD is a community-based nonprofit that was created after Hurricane Katrina. Its intent was to look at how to communities, particularly underserved communities, address and deal with the issues of natural environment. The second component was looking at economic development and how you sustain a community that's been hit by disaster, but as well as how it continues to grow after that disaster and beyond. This is kind of our catalyst of what brings us as an organization in this community together. And we constantly are looking ways to, one, preserve this body, to bring it back to its freshwater habitat, and eventually to bring it as multiple lines of defense with cypress trees and some aspects of a swamp. We're trying to kind of lead the way. So we're trying to say, look, we're doing this not with any public dollars, but getting the grass cut, picking up the trash. We make that happen. And I think we just have to work together and collaborate and put our heads together on how we can make things happen. And then we can collaborate with our local governments as well to enhance that as we continue to educate this community, and not only the lower Ninth Ward, but we're talking about Orleans and the greater New Orleans area, and realizing the importance of understanding not only who we are, but where we are. Again, it's showing that the community is interested in every community, whether you're affluent or not so affluent, whether you're young or whether you're a senior, we all are concerned about it, and we know that, and we just need to make sure that our legislative members understand that when we put them in office of what's important and how we can work together to make for a better environment and better quality of life.
We've set the stage. Now it's time for Corey Miller, our resident social scientist at CRCL, planning for the next generation's coast and communities. I can't read, but he's a social scientist.
All right, thank you very much. I direct the outreach and engagement for CRCL. I'm glad to see so many familiar and also new faces in the audience, so I think we did something right today, at least. I'm going to go ahead and switch gears just a bit here and kind of really talk about what everything we've seen really means for our residents and for our communities, and not just for you sitting here in this room today, but really for the next generations to come. And I'm glad that we have some of the 300 participants here as well, because this really is going to be their challenge and their task to lead the way into our future. So we've seen some really good information so far. We've seen the trajectory of land loss. We've lost a lot of land. We know that we're going to continue to have challenges and lose more land in certain areas of our coast. We also know that we have a strategy, the multiple lines of defense strategy, that's going to help us to be able to work, live, and play in certain areas of the coast into the future. And while there is uncertainty with sea level rise, as it was touched on earlier, we are very fortunate to have the master plan process that is this living document, this living process that is able to manage that uncertainty and still take action to address these challenges into the future. And so, if we think about that future, and if the master plan is fully funded and fully implemented in 50 years, we can envision that the coast may look a little something like this. And what you see here is in the darker shades of green, those are wetlands that are sustained as a result of the master plan. The lighter green is new wetlands that are created through sediment diversions, marsh creation projects. And all of the red lines on there represent the levees. The dotted ones are planned levees. The solid ones are levees that are already constructed. But we do need to make sure that we have to maintain and continue to fund those levees. Otherwise, they don't give us the protection that they currently do. And so what does this future really mean for our communities? And specifically, what does this mean for flooding? So we have I'm going to show 3 images that show current flood risk and how that flood risk can change into the future. So first off, this is current day. The darker greens, the darker blues in here represent the greatest depths of flood, and that's actually 15 feet or greater of flood depths. And this is what would occur if a 100-year storm event or a significant hurricane hit at any given point along that coast. And so the lightest shades of green, still stuck on those greens. The lightest shades of blue are 3 feet or less. So if we see how this changes into the future with that master plan fully funded and implemented, you clearly see a lot more dark blue that shows up along the coast. So I'll go back one more just so you can kind of see that change. And while it is unfortunate that this is the reality that we face, that even as we address this issue as best we can, that we still have more flooding that will occur into the future. If we compare that, though, with what would happen if we sat on our hands and did not do anything, you could clearly see how much more of the coast gets covered in a significant hurricane event. So that's with the plan, and that's if we don't take action. So if this is the future that we face with the plan fully implemented and funded, we could see in this image really 2 of the 3 components of the multiple lines of defense strategy. So in the green shades is the result of restoration projects being implemented on our landscape. The other component shown here is the structural protection, so the levees, floodgates, and that's all depicted in red. What's not clearly visible in here is that the third leg of that stool, the third piece, the non-structural. And really we need to think about non-structural as what individuals can do and different actions that can be taken at the local level or regional level to really help us address this increased flood risk that we're anticipating. And so while Bren did touch on the master plan and the non-structural component of that, this gets a little bit deeper into it. So at the top of there, we have a map that outlines in the 2017 master plan all of the different project areas where non-structural is recommended. So this is over 32 different projects. Within that, as Bren mentioned, there's 3 main types of actions that are being planned for in this arena. So flood proofing of non-residential, elevating residential, and then voluntary acquisition of residential structures as well. And that's all depending on the anticipated flood depths. And the shading in all of those project areas is basically showing the number of structures that's recommended. And this accounts for over $6 billion in the master plan. Now, this is great. This is a great goal and a target for us to have. But as Bren mentioned, the funding that is currently available is largely tied to restoration projects. So there isn't a giant pot of money sitting to start doing these projects. And really, if we really want to think about what resilient communities look like, and by resilient I mean communities that are not only able to rebound from a hurricane or a flood event, but communities that are able to thrive into that future landscape. That really encompasses more than just this, and really it's more than what's in the scope of what CPRA it has to do. And this has to do, again, with actions that can be taken at the local level by parish governments and individuals. And so what we really need to be planning for is how populations are going to be changing, how communities are going to be changing, and we actually have already seen a little bit of this change. So in this map here, this is based off of census data from 2000 to 2010, and it shows how populations are moving, and this is largely correlated with increased flood risk. So you see in the larger circles means more of a population shift, red means people are leaving, green means people are coming. And so in communities that are in very low-lying areas like way south in Plaquemines and Buras, or in Lafitte that are outside of federal levees, we've seen a significant decrease in the populations. In other areas that are on high ground, such as Mandeville and Beta Springs, we've seen significant increases. And more than just people moving, what often occurs with this is that people with resources that have the means to leave are the ones that are taking these actions and making these decisions on their own. And when that happens, in the red communities, it starts to drain some of the resources that are there. You start to lose some of the social services, such as healthcare, grocery stores, and things like that. And what's happening in the green areas, if this isn't really very thoughtfully planned and prepared, is that you end up having kind of a surge of population, which then puts a strain on the resources that are there. So infrastructure and stormwater management and things like that become an increasing concern. And so I'm going to highlight two examples that kind of give a little bit more meat to this change that is occurring, and really forward thinking of how we can anticipate that these changes are going to occur, but how do we really prepare and plan for that so that we can have those resilient communities moving forward. The first effort is Resilient New Orleans. Now, Resilient New Orleans is a strategy to really envision, we're celebrating the 300th anniversary of New Orleans. If we want to celebrate the 600th anniversary, I know that's a considerable time away. What do we really need to start doing now in order to prepare for that? And so the city of New Orleans got some funding through the Rockefeller Foundation, and they were one of the first what's called the 100 Resilient Cities. And Rockefeller around the world has identified urban centers that are challenged by changing environmental conditions. And New Orleans was fortunate enough to be selected. And with that, funding came to basically create a resilient office of resiliency, and this Resilient New Orleans strategy. And in those lovely colored boxes there, that's the three visions that the strategy embraces. So adapt to thrive, you could really think about that as embracing the changing coast and the changing climate. So as if any of you have been in the city in the past couple of weeks, we are seeing increased flood events that pop up out of nowhere that are really taxing on our stormwater management systems. So how do we improve that? How do we work towards being able to handle that capacity better into the future? Connect to opportunity. So making sure that we have equitable access to housing and employment and jobs into the future. Transform city systems. To me, that screams our public transit. How do we make sure that people can get where they need to go in a more effective and efficient manner? And to give one kind of concrete example of what all of this may look like, and a project that has already occurred, in this image right here, this is a retention pond that was constructed, and there was a culvert that was placed in the sidewalk. So if you would imagine, just as we had a couple of a week or two ago, a very heavy, quick downpour that saturates and floods the city streets and overwhelms the drainage system. What this enables is when the water is flooding into the street and the drain is backed up, it's able to bypass the drain, go underneath the sidewalk, and fill into this ponding area there. And so not only does this help with the flooding issue, when it's dry, it's a recreational space. It also adds, some aesthetic beautification to the neighborhood. And the wetland grasses and the fact that this exists in a neighborhood helps to connect these flooding issues to tangible solutions that we need to be embracing and employing. The next effort that I'm going to talk about is the LA SAFE, Louisiana Strategic Adaptations for Future Environments. This was a community planning effort that was done by the Office of Community Development with significant support from Foundation for Louisiana. And through this effort, 6 parishes, and residents rather, of 6 parishes were engaged over a very lengthy kind of planning and envisioning process. This was St. Tammany, St. John the Baptist, Terrebonne, Lafourche, Jefferson, and Plaquemines. And really, through this process, thinking back to that map that I showed where the populations are shifting, realizing that into the future, we're going to have different risk areas of flooding. So we have, we're going to have low risk areas like those green circles that I showed before. We're going to have high risk areas like the red circles, and then we're going to have moderate. And so how do we really plan appropriately for this risk that we anticipate into the future so that we can have resilient and thriving communities in these areas? And so I'll spend just a moment to touch on so the community members came to several meetings, and they were asked to contribute their vision of, if you were in a high, low, or medium risk area, what would your vision of that community be into the future that is a wonderful place that you want to continue to live and play, work, et cetera. So in low risk areas, we would expect that the green circles, these are going to be areas where populations are going to be moving to. So we're going to have denser residential housing. And with denser residential housing means that there's going to be more paving of green space. So then with that, we're going to have better, improved stormwater management. But we want to also maintain green space and other services like transportation. In medium risk areas, these are areas that are, you could think of that for kind of an average storm or an average hurricane or a smaller hurricane, that these will still be protected and they won't necessarily flood in a general flood event. But these are areas that will still likely flood if they get hit by a significant hurricane. And so we want to make sure that we have elevated transportation routes in these areas. We want to make sure that if populations do start to shift somewhat, that we maintain those key services like grocery stores, health and recreation. And we want to make sure that we also have appropriate jobs and housing in those areas. In the high-risk areas, we can anticipate that these are going to be areas that are going to flood when we have just almost a tropical storm sometimes, like we have seen in some of our low-lying areas already in coastal Louisiana. But although these places will still flood, people need to work here in these places. We have a lot of economies that are directly tied to the resources and these environments that are very close to the Gulf. So if people still need to work in these areas, how do we make sure that it's safe for them to do so? How do we realize that we need to have housing and plan for housing that is hardened, that's going to stand up to a hurricane, and anticipate that a hurricane is going to push some water into these communities. People are going to need to evacuate and get to safety. But how do we make sure that people can return back to their communities, have elevated houses that are above the flood waters, and get back to a sense of normalcy of life as quickly as possible? So although we do have some challenges that lie ahead, I hope that it's been communicated that we do have some hope with the strategies that have been outlined, with the projects that are planned. We have a mechanism to deal with this uncertainty. We really need to be challenging ourselves to think long-term, to think not just about our kids and grandkids, but even further down the road than that. And I know that's difficult to do with day-to-day problems and issues, but for the safety and sake of the future of this coast that we want everyone to be able to continue to enjoy, these are the challenges that we need to tackle. And so I'll just leave you with this reminder of the multiple lines of defense strategy, and with this charge for action. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Corey Miller. Any questions for Corey before we take our break? There's a couple.
Thank you. When you mentioned about the infiltration rates and so forth, and this Rockefeller grant, I'm curious, is there any money inside that grant for code enforcement in New Orleans, which would help in terms of people not paving over? There are codes about how much a home, an area can actually pave,
yeah,
et cetera.
So that strategy, the I guess brilliant thing about it is there was a lot of work that was done prior to the strategy. So I don't know if you're familiar with the urban water plan, which is basically how do we really live with water in the city, which makes a lot of recommendations for incentivizing permeable pavement and things like that. So this strategy has adopted the work that came before it, but then also has created the space to incorporate new efforts that are coming after it. As far as the specific funding, I am not sure on that. I can get back to you though.
Yeah, I was just hoping you could speak to some specific examples of projects that CRCL has worked on to address the issues you've talked about.
So first and foremost, we pull together events like this. We try to make sure that communities are educated and knowledgeable about the challenges that they face into the future. We do have a volunteer restoration program where we engage volunteers to do everything from plant cypress trees to marsh grasses to put up sand fences and do dune restoration. We also have an oyster shell recycling program where we build living shoreline projects. So we do work on the ground. We do realize, though, that in the grand scheme of things, that these projects are small. And so we really focus on the educational and kind of acknowledgement of these issues to get more people involved.
I've got a question on this side.
Yep.
Somebody?
Sorry. Oh, we
Nobody?
have one on
Oh, he's got, we'll get this one and then we'll.
the
Thank you, sir.
the Gentilly. So as in the same process or I guess effort that provided the funding for the LA Safe, the City of New Orleans was also a recipient of this grant funding, and within that there's the Gentilly Resilience District that has been planned, and so that outlines several different projects, such as in more of those rain garden or rather retention pond projects. And so I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for in that, but the lady sitting right in front of you can definitely give you more detail than I can.
Hi, Corey.
Yes.
Anthropologist here. Always nice to meet another social scientist. So, you know, everything you've talked about is terrific and vital. And I loved your example of having the communities provide their vision of how their neighborhood has to change to respond to their risk level. But at the same time, what is going to be required, in my mind, is massive fundamental cultural change. People are going to have to expect a different look, a different feel for their city than the way people in our culture generally think of a city looking and feeling. We're going to have to relearn how to live with water. And I'm curious if you have thoughts, or if anyone else does, on how we can make that happen in a way that's productive but also equitable. So it's not coming top down so much as laterally, if you follow me.
Yeah. So one thing I failed to mention with that LA Safe project, it wasn't simply a planning project. There is a significant amount of money that is going to actually put projects in each of those 6 parishes. I think first and foremost, though, we need to continue to educate our friends, neighbors, and I mean, it's great that everyone is in here. I wish that we would have had to have pulled in another third of this crowd to accommodate even a larger audience in here. So the education is really key, and being just upfront and frank and talking about these problems and challenges.
Great, I'm the firecracker. That's my role here today. It's to process all of that information that we got this morning, which was really great. But it's really to answer some questions about what can we do and what do we need to do. And so, you know, there's lots of things to think about. Let's see. My little work thing isn't working. All right, someone's going to help. So there are lots of things to think about. And before we start coming up with action that needs to be taken, I want to first let you know that the point of this conversation is really to understand the give and the take of taking action. Okay, there's a give and a take. Now, because we're in this era of, you know, a more gentle society, we're trying to correct some of our historic wrongs around patriarchy and things like that. Let me just say it could also be, instead of a give and take, an offer and a receive. Okay, so if give and take is too harsh, offer and receive will work as well. Everybody all right? All right, thank you. So the first part of giving and taking is to just take a minute. And I want us to just take a minute, and if you will, just indulge me if you can just uncross your legs, put 2 feet on the ground, uncross your arms, put them either in your lap or just somewhere loose. Take your phone out of your hand, take your device out of your hand, just for a second, 1 second. It's not hard, just take a minute. Because the first part of give and take is to take a minute. We want to take a minute to hear and process what's happening to our coast and to her ecosystem. And I want you just at your own pace to just take a breath on that. Take a breath. This is big information. This is a lot of stuff. This is big science. This is a lot of people. This is our coast. This is our home. This is our land. This is our tradition. We have to take a minute to just process what's going on before we take action. Let's take one more breath and offer some positive, intentional energy to the communities that are in the fight for their lives. They're in the fight for their survival. Before we come up with big ideas, before we make more theories, before we engage in the way we want to move, let's keep in mind the communities that are in the fight for their life, and let's offer that collective breath to them. And while we're taking a minute and taking one more breath, let's commit our actions to the broader, inclusive, long-term win for our great state of Louisiana. This means we have to start thinking differently. This is not just about what one person wants, what one household wants, what one community wants. This is about what's best for all of South Louisiana, all of Louisiana's coast, and that means the give and the take is going to have to be part of an ongoing process. Everybody all right? Y'all all right? Okay. Well, let's just keep on going, because the next thing we need to take is our democracy. Now, you may be wondering what democracy has to do with coastal Louisiana, and the answer is everything. These decisions and these planning processes that we keep hearing about, they go through the people that we elect. So let's just take a little quiz. This isn't a text quiz, this is a PowerPoint quiz, because I'm not high tech like Corey. I gotta get up on it. Okay, who's the governor of Louisiana? Shout it out. Great, that's good. 100%, yes. All right, our two senators, shout them out. Cassidy and Kennedy, we got it. It's a little lower. It's like a B+. But that's good, you know, that's passing. B+ is passing. All right, let's get a little with it now. South Louisiana congressional representatives. I heard Scalise, I heard Richmond, Graves, one more, Higgins. All right. If you don't know these folks, you need to know them. This is part of our democracy. We don't just get to live in this state without knowing who's representing us in Washington. You don't get to live in this state and not know who is speaking on behalf of our entire state. Taking back the democracy is not about blaming the elected officials for not doing what you want to do. It's about you declaring right here and right now, this is our state, and you're going to hold these folks that you've elected accountable to what's best for our state. Y'all with me? All right, now listen, this is not easy. It's not easy. You actually got to do a little work, all right? Hard work, sweat and work. You don't have to plant any grass in the mud, although I think we should all do that. We'll call Corey for how to do that later. You don't have to plant any grass in the mud, but you are going to have to pick up the phone. You're going to have to pick up the phone. You're going to have to pick up a pen. You're going to have to get on your keyboard or your iPhones or whatever the young folks are using these days. I feel so old up here. I'm sorry. You have to use all of those things, and you're going to have to communicate what you believe to your elected officials. All right? So this is not just about them doing what you want after you never told them what you wanted. This is about them doing what you want as you remind them again and again and again and again, and I'll just say it one more time, again and again, what you want and what's important for Louisiana. So we got to take back our democracy, all right? So this is our state, our representation at the DC level and at the state level. And let's talk about who else we need to be reaching out to. There are a few agencies you need to know. Let's see how we go here. Anybody know what that little logo's for? Army Corps. That's right. Anybody know this logo? A little fewer folks know this Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Council. This is a federal level council. These folks, some of the money that we heard about with our CPRA planning, like these folks are controlling dollars and what we do with dollars. Not every dollar, but significant amounts of money are coming through these federal agencies. So it's also called the Restore Council. Anybody ever heard of HUD? What does HUD stand for? HUD, Housing and Urban Development. Housing and Urban Development. What does housing have to do with restoring the coast and oyster shells? Because where are we going to live? Because these ecosystems that we talk about, we can't continue to just talk about them without the people who are part of these ecosystems. And the Department of Housing and Urban Development comes in after these storms and floods, and oftentimes is responsible for making sure that there's at least temporary housing, if not long-term housing, for people to live and thrive, as Corey was saying. Okay, so we've got to know these agencies, and we've got to engage with them. Uh-oh, bad word. Four-letter word has been brought to the half shell. I'll say it. FEMA. FEMA. You know, people like me who were, lived through Katrina, it's not a lot of love for FEMA. But at the end of the day, FEMA works for me. And so when I don't like FEMA and the way things are going, I have to engage at the federal level and make sure that FEMA now will at least work for my niece and my nephews a little bit better than it did for me. It's important that we know HUD and FEMA and the Restore Council and the Army Corps of Engineers, because if we're just writing John Bell Edwards or Steve Scalise, we're not actually getting to those who have all of the decision-making control of what happens, okay? So remember some of these. And I think, I'm not sure if you're going to get copies of this. I think so. Yeah, it'll be somewhere. It'll be somewhere. And just when you thought you were finished, just when you thought you had figured out everybody to reach out to, somebody gave you a whole new list of folks. Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, we have representatives here. Department of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Quality, Department of Health and Hospitals, Office of Community Development, I know we have some representatives here, your parish government, city government, parish or city council, and zoning commissions. Lord have mercy, I'm tired just reading it. We got some work to do. We got some work to do. And so I want to point out the Coastal Zone Management Office for those of you who live in the southern part of this state, because they are responsible for managing a lot of the projects and the zoning of the projects that are going to be happening. I'm just laying them out for you. We can talk more about these later, but it's time for you to start knowing some of these agencies, lest you think it's just your one city council person who has control of all of South Louisiana. It doesn't work like that, okay? We've got to know folks at all the levels. So what else do we need to do in this give and take? You need to give your opinion. Now, I'm one of those people who likes to give my opinion all the time. You can ask anybody who knows me. I have an opinion about everything. I have an opinion about these plastic water bottles. I have an opinion about, okay, so you know what I'm saying? I have opinions. And that's cool. It's really cool sometimes to be that person to always point out the plastic water bottles. You could be that person. I'll be that person. But what's more important is that you give your opinion formally. How many of you in this room have given formal public comment? Excellent, excellent. When we say formal public comment, what we mean is there's a project or an issue, and they're asking for the public's opinion. It's usually some weird time frame, 15 days, 30 days, 45 days, 90 days to issue a public comment. And there's usually some random person, usually from Gulf Restoration Network or somewhere, knocking on your door saying, fill out this card so we can get a public comment, because we want the public's input in on the issue. It doesn't matter what the issue is, your comment is hereby demanded formally. You got to put your name and your address, and you have to publicly comment. You are a resident of South Louisiana, you are a resident of Louisiana, you deserve to have your voice heard and taken into consideration. And when they see public comments, they pay attention. Maybe they don't read all of them, but when it's 12 million, they know they have a situation to deal with. Y'all see what I'm saying? Okay, so we got to get with it. There are annual plans, master plans, and scoping projects. And we heard from our friend at CPRA, they do the CPRA plan every 5 years, now every 6 years. They need public input for that, for all of the changes that have to be made. So let's keep this in mind. Give your opinion formally. In the give and take, the next thing you need to do is actually take the invitation to participate. I know that if you live in South Louisiana, somebody knocked, sent a mail, sent an email, and said, please come and participate in this meeting. And I'm sure many of you, I'm not pointing any fingers, I just happen to know that some people didn't show up. That's all I'm saying. It's time for us to start showing up. We can't have these planning processes and we don't show up. We have to start going, and you get to give your opinion. You get to talk about water bottles. You get to tell them if the food isn't good. You get to say whatever you want to say. But also, you get to learn what they know, and you get to understand what's happening, and it's time for us to participate. Since we already heard a little bit about the LA Safe program, what I'll mention is the Foundation for Louisiana in particular took the time to engage many of the communities it had engaged with during Katrina and said, listen, y'all, there's a bigger issue at play here. We need your participation. And there was great care taken to develop that LA Safe program with the Office of Community Development, I think it was, but also with the Foundation for Louisiana, using its network to engage. There is a website for you to go to, the lasafe.la.gov website. It's time for you to sign up for the email, sign up for the mail, sign up for the notices so that you can participate in those public meetings. Next in the give and take, now this one might hit you a little tough, is to give new funding ideas a role in your advocacy for the coast. Now this is one of those things where it's like, you have an idea of what should happen. But we have to understand that every new project and idea that we want to happen, it has to have funding behind it. And so what's our idea around putting funding behind these new advocacy pieces? We have to be willing to levy taxes. Everybody all right? Y'all all right? Okay. We have to be willing to levy taxes to invest in Louisiana's future. We live in one of those weird purple states, right? We hate the government, we love the government. We need the government, we hate the government. And it's time for us to actually understand that if we want the government to provide certain things, we actually have to pay for it. At the same time, you get to understand that we are the government. You see what I'm saying? This is not just about you giving your money to people to do something to you. This is about you choosing how to use your investment for your community. And so we need you to give funding ideas a space in your advocacy, not just what you want, but how can Louisiana get it? We have to advocate for state dollars to go toward payment for levee system maintenance. Anybody live near a levee system? I saw some Plaquemines folk in here. There's too many hands in here. If we're living close to levee systems, we got to keep them up, or what's the use of having them? What's the use of having them? Next in the give and take is to take time to watchdog the current funding and coastal projects. Watch the money. Watch the money. We can no longer afford to be a citizenry of folks who don't know where billions of dollars, y'all saw those numbers up there this morning? Billions of dollars. We're not going to get to blame anybody for billions of dollars but ourselves. We got to watch that money. It's time for us to start watchdogging some of this. Become a project champion. Participate in restoration. That's the sand fence Corey was talking about. We really should get with CRCL around some of these processes to actually participate in rebuilding our coast and restoring our coast. And I keep saying Corey because I bug him all the time, and if you got any questions, you should feel free to bug him too. I personally believe people who get paid to do this work should have to work. It's just how I feel. It's just a little something new. We need to take ownership of Louisiana's future coast. We need to learn more, and we need to teach others. Everything you learned here today, that word cloud that just came up, it's time for us to start telling our neighbors. It's time for us to start having crawfish in the backyard and a conversation about what you learned at the State of the Coast Conference. You hear what I'm saying? We can't just keep this stuff to ourselves and pontificate and think about how we're going to change the world. It's time to get the crew together. It's time to get people in, and it's time for us to start teaching and learning with one another. We have to do outreach for events like this. Next year, 2 years, right, Corey? We got 2 years to totally take over the convention center. Y'all with me? We just want regular people taking over the convention center. 2 years. We got to do outreach for State of the Coast in 2020. And follow up and share your ideas on social media. Attend these CPRA board meetings and other public meetings and build your own knowledge around the resources that we have. We have to do it. We cannot give our fate to people we don't know. We have to engage, and we have to be part of restoring South Louisiana. Thank you.
Hear, hear to all of it. We have a little bit of time for some questions. Who has a question for Colette?
Sorry. How'd you chew my mint?
Here's a question.
Yeah, I think about it all the time, especially when I made that one slide with our representation for Louisiana. I was like, what's wrong with this picture? I tell you what, I'll run if you run. And we got about 100 other women in here. Let's all run. Let's all run and change this state. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Hey, babe. Oh, okay. I'm sorry? Okay, well, I would have picked crawfish, which was not on the list. That was Corey's fault. In fact, I love crawfish so much, I think I might be part crawfish. I'm from Slidell. I'm from St. Tammany Parish. I'm from a bayou called Bayou Liberty. I'm a bayou person, and I identify as a rural bayou person. And I'm the fastest shrimp peeler this side of the Mississippi, hands down. I'll take any bets, and I like to be paid in whiskey.
You have a question? Yeah. One more back here.
Hi, Colette.
Hey, babe.
So you just gave us a ton of work to do here. But you know, I'm all about prioritization.
Mm-hmm.
So if there was one action that you could see from everybody here, if you had to choose just one thing that everybody needed to do in the next week, what would it be?
It would be to have a dinner that we already know how to have in South Louisiana with everybody in our family, including the uncle that aggravates you, and the auntie that talks too much, and the cousin that's always late, and have a conversation and ask one question: do y'all know what's going on with the coast in South Louisiana? Do you really know what's going on? And it's not a moment for you to teach. It's a moment for all of us to learn how to listen, because what's going on for people is different. But we can't begin the conversation until folks are invited into the conversation. And we can't just beat people over the head with the information. People have to be ready to hear it. So that's what I would say. Let's do what we do in South Louisiana. Let's eat together. Let's sit together. Let's reclaim, you know, the traditions that make us such a unique space. And let's ask people one question: do you know what's happening to the land in South Louisiana? Thank you.
We got time for one more. Anybody got one more question for Colette? What a great talk.
All
Thank you
right.
so
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thanks, everybody.
Tremendous job. All right, we have had 4 tremendous presentations. I need this one. Now it's time for a little panel discussion. We have some incredible panelists. We're going to bring Chief up, and I'm sorry, where's Jonathan? Sorry. There's Jonathan. Come on up. We're going to turn some lights on so we don't have any more presentations. We're going to see a little bit better. And I'm going to hand this to you guys. All right, so this one is on. We'll have to pass this a little bit. Turn that other one on. Might have to turn our cell phones back on and put the flashlights on. So let me introduce these panelists, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves a little bit more extensively. I just want to tell you who they are. At the end of the table, we have Captain Ryan Lambert. He is Cajun Fishing Adventures Incorporated, sorry. In the middle, we have Denise Shervington, and she is with the Institute of Women and Ethics Studies. Sorry, I can't see. We have Carol Babel of Ashe Cultural Arts Center, and then we have Chief Thomas Dardar Jr., the United Home and Nation, and we also have Jonathan Foray, Wetlands Discovery Center. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry I butchered that a little bit. So if we could, I'm going to start with Captain Lambert. And Captain, if you would grab that microphone and just tell us a little bit about yourself, and we'll go down the line.
I'm Captain Ryan Lambert. I've been guiding in South Louisiana for saltwater species and ducks for some 39 years now. So I have watched the land disappear in a more intimate way. I go every day and I see every time you go, more land is gone. Every time you go from the different seasons, whether you're fishing the spring season or winter season, when you go back next spring, that's gone. You have to find a new spot. I see the duck ponds have turned to open water. I've seen it all, but I have a unique thing that was given to me, and that's diversions. I probably know more about how diversions work than most people alive because I work in them every day. All the people that are anti-diversion hadn't been in a diversion. They talk about diversions that aren't even open. I have 19 of them that flow 300,000 cubic feet per second that I work in every day. I see how they grow land. I see how they grow aquatic vegetation. I see how they grow animals and birds. And so I have a different perspective on all of it. So that's why I'm such a advocate for coastal restoration.
Thank you, Captain. Denise.
My name is Denise Shervington. I am a psychiatrist and public health specialist. After Katrina, my career changed somewhat, dealing with post-disaster, the impact of disaster on communities, particularly communities of color, young people, and poor communities, and looking at the mental health and traumatic impact that disasters have on health.
Thank you, Denise.
Is there a reason why I have a psychiatrist by me?
Yeah. There might be.
So good morning. My name is Carol Bebel, and I identify as a human service planner and an artist. Human service planner was my first career, and I worked in the public sector. And then in the second chapter of my life, I was am co-founder of a community-based cultural arts center. And what we do is we look at culture as the lens through which we do everything. We live inside of a cultural lens, and we should work, play, and problem solve there as well. And so we look for opportunities to be able to sit with people who are also trying to solve problems.
Thank you, Carol.
Bonjour, Halito. Good morning. Avant tout, mes parents pour parler avec vous ce matin, pour donner la vérité de notre territoire. So, I start with parler en anglais for tous les autres. I just asked my ancestors to allow me to speak in front of you today because it's not often we're allowed to come in front of people and speak. So please understand that when we come to you and speak to you, it's for our betterment of our tribe and for our relations and our elders that we're here because they set us and allowed us to do this. In saying that, I'm Thomas Stoddard Jr., Principal Chief of the United Human Nation. I represent 17,000 citizens. Soon to pass the torch over to my good friend and buddy, Chief-elect August Coco Capel here, and another tribal member that we have here, Ms. Jessica Barfay, that's here with me this morning. And other tribal members that are here from other tribes, welcome. Thank you all for being here. In this coastal land loss, and just to give you a little bit about, and I know we're going to have our time for presentation, but in the areas that we talk about when you talk about land loss, sea level rise and all this, as the captain says, we live it, breathe it, work it, play it. It's who we are and what we are. We identify to the land and water, and unfortunately the land is starting to diminish, and we'll go into discussion further on into the panel here. So for now, I want to thank everyone that's invited us here and allowed us this opportunity to be in front of you today and allowing my ancestors to have space here for us to discuss these issues that are before us. So, Yokoke.
My name is Jonathan Forey. I'm the Executive Director for the South Louisiana Wetlands Discovery Center. And we work with K through 12 students, mostly in Terrebonne Parish, but also some in Lafourche Parish, working to educate them on the challenges we face as coastal communities, trying to give them the information that they need to make good decisions about their lives in the future. So,
wonderful. Keep that, please. So thank you all for introducing yourselves. Now what we've done, we've set up some questions that we're going to ask our panelists individually, but feel free to chime in, ask a question, make a comment. This is an open discussion and we want you to feel empowered to talk. But let's start off with a question. We'll start off with Chief Dardar, if that's all right. How has the environment changed with land loss, and how has that affected you and your people?
With land loss, oh, I'm sorry, I grabbed the mic. Okay, I got it. I guess one of the major topics that people have been talking about recently is the land loss and tidal rise and everything else. And our tribe and with the other tribe that's on the island are going to be some of the first citizens that are going to be relocated in the United States because of this issue. And what brings it on, just recently I was looking at one of these history channels where a large iceberg broke off, where it was lodged from hundreds of years, I guess, and all of a sudden it's broken off, and it was about the size of the state of Delaware. Feel sorry for the people in Delaware because they've been referenced to a lot of things, land loss, ice break, but when you're thinking of a massive, when you think of a state that way, and having to be relocated, and for people to come to our area, and you take them in areas, and we drop the anchor, and they look and they say, okay, why do we stop here? Then you enlighten them and they say, well, back when I was a kid, we used to hunt right here in this very spot that we're fixing to throw a line and fish. Really? And then when you take them down the island road, or you take them down areas where there's water. In fact, my sister lived in Tennessee for a long time, and we brought her back to the island to go visit, and she scooted to the middle of the car because the water was so close to the highway that even though, she's grown up in the area, and you leave out there and you come back after a few years, and you realize that so many things have changed, that land loss, and people relocating. Some of them having to relocate because even after the hurricanes, we can name them all. We've always lived with them. But when they come in and they destroy about 75% of your community, and only 25% of the homes are left there, you have to do something. These little trailers that, of course, the four-letter word FEMA brings in, and, they cause illness, and they were good, and we thank them for that. But, I mean, what they were replacing, what we got out of it was illness and everything else. So a lot of people are leaving and relocating, but now they're trying to keep the communities together and relocate them together. So, yes, when you lose that identity, lose who you are, then you have to become the melting pot, and then you're no longer then who you are at that point. Do you lose your identity as an indigenous nation? You try to continue in operating in that capacity, realizing that you used to farm, you used to fish, and I've talked to someone this morning about the estuaries, the changes in that we have in those departments. People are really having to change their life, their eating habits, work habits, and everything else changes. So I'm a whole lot of.
Thank you, Chief. I appreciate it. Jonathan, how about you? What have you seen in the changes, and how has it affected what you see?
So my dad grew up in Cocodrie, which is a southernmost community in Terrebonne Parish, and my mom in Chauvin, which is one just north of that. And then they married, and when they decided to start their family, they moved to Little Caillou, which was one community just north of there. And then in 1985, Hurricane Juan put about 2 feet of water in our house. And they drove around looking for the highest land still within that area. And so they bought a piece of property in Berg, which was the community right above Little Caillou, and built their home there, where I finished growing up. And then when it came time for me to buy a house, I bought my house in Homa, which is one community north of Berg. So just within, and my story is not one that is that's uncommon. I mean, this is sort of what's happening in the southernmost parts of the state. It's sort of naturally, well, it's not natural progression, but there's sort of this diaspora that's taking place that we are all moving north generation after generation. My mom was a principal at an elementary school in Terrebonne Parish, Boudreaux Canal, which was elementary school that was the southernmost, well, maybe not, well, on that bayou anyway, it was the southernmost. And once she retired, they closed the school down because there were not enough children in the area to warrant keeping that school open. After that happened, then the next school just above that shut down. So that's sort of an indication as well that the people are moving away out of harm's way, out of that out of the path of the flood, if that's the right thing to say.
Thank you, Jonathan. Captain Ryan, why don't you just you've already kind of touched on it a little bit, and but how have you seen things change and affect you?
Well, my change is twofold. It's infrastructure and it's habitat and environment. If you look at the infrastructure, I'm from Buras. That's where that 67% circle was up there a little while ago, where 67% of people have left. When we have 3 grocery stores, 2 schools, 2 banks, now you can't get fresh produce. So everything I have to do, I have to run 70 miles to get. So when you think about that, I can't even put money in the bank. You know, you could do it all electronically, but I'm old school and I don't trust all that yet. So, but if you think about the things that are gone from your infrastructure, you try to run a business like that, it makes it twice as hard, but it's not near as bad as the environmental loss. When you've lost as much as we have, the west side of the Mississippi River in Buras is 100% gone. There is no land left. When I started guiding there, I could take my boat and I'd have to go from bayou to bay, and make my way to the Gulf. I can take my boat, get in it, and never touch the steering wheel and go to the Gulf of Mexico without ever worrying about it's 4 foot deep everywhere. So and with that, the fishery depletes on that side. If you think about it, the fish, shrimp, crabs, everything comes in microscopic. Everything is so tiny. Don't think about the speckled trout, redfish, anything. Just think about croakers. Think about it. If there's 1 million croakers and they eat 100 a day, that's 100 million of those animals leaving us every day because there's no freshwater aquatic vegetation, there's no edge, there's no place for them to hide from predation, so everything collapsed. I don't fish on the west side, maybe 10%. I didn't even know how to get to the east side when I was a younger man. And by the way, I'm so happy to see so many young people in here because you are the future. We do what we do for you, not for us. I'm done. Everything I do is for the next generation.
Thank you, Captain. Ms. Carroll, how does the experience of hurricanes and flooding show up in your work? In other words, how is it reflected in arts and culture and health?
I'll start off by saying that the comment that I want to make is that as we talk about the folks who are in the room, who's not in the room are artists and culture bearers in numbers. I have a culture bearer sitting next to me, but that's not a major portion of the population that's been called into this conversation. And so we do have artists that are actively speaking this. They're spitting it in poetry. They're putting it up on walls in artwork. And we're seeing things that show up on stage that bring this to life. And so clearly that's one of the places where the work shows up. And it also shows up in teaching. And I didn't hear teachers as a list of the folks that were in the room either. And so when we talk about children, one of our new artistic director says we don't so much inherit the land from our ancestors as much as we borrow it from our children. And that whatever is going to be new and better and different is going to be done in the next generation. And so we try to teach into the new information about honoring the earth and making decisions and being fierce citizens. Hashtag Fierce Citizen is our hashtag for our kids. And we have a covenant, and we have a covenant in this country together, and it talks about we, the people. And we do a lot of we-making. And that's the other thing that I think that's really important, is for us to be about the business of we-making. This issue of the cognitive, the head, the heart, and the gut. We have a lot of information that's operating here, but it's really the heart and the gut. It's the spirit of people that will draw them into the conversation. And so it is about being able to kind of talk about all of these tensions. Our industry gives the world a way to talk about when there are contradictions at work, and it's called creative tension. And so people are living their lives, often lives that are scarce. People are vulnerable. And then we have this big conversation about whether or not in 50 years they're going to be able to be there, or in 20 years they're going to be able to live in a certain place. Well, we live in a city where in a day we were all having to go. We were gone. The city was full of water. And so we've lived inside of what it is that all of this is about. And so we have an experience that we want to keep present to people so that they can better think about who they are and what it is that they want to do. And to do that despite their vulnerability, despite the fact that they're often not at the table, despite the fact that often getting the word to them is not the first thing that's thought about, or the first thing that's thought about in terms of hearing from them. Because again, I think that there's a lot of wisdom and science that's at work inside of regular folks that could be really helpful here in making this a cause celeb rather than a rising movement.
Thank you. Dr. Denise, I wanted to ask you about how you see things in the healthcare realm when you see these flooding situations and hurricanes and it being exacerbated through some of the problems that we've seen here in New Orleans.
Well, what I see, recognized or not, is the impact of what disasters do to the psyche, which is a death encounter. And if people, whether they're consciously aware or not, then develop anxiety. And then that can turn up in about 20% of people who have these experiences when there are acute shocks that are a result of chronically how we're not taking care of the earth. 20% are going to have post-traumatic stress disorder, depression. It turns up in substance abuse. It turns up with aggression, so especially in young people who don't have the language to talk about their fears and their anxieties, they act it out. And so what I see is mental health, a new brand of mental health problems that as a city and a state, we don't have the resources to deal with.
Thank you very much. Audience members, do y'all have anything you'd like to ask the panel? Yes.
Sure. It would start with, first of all, recognizing there are lots of ways that information gets in the community. Kids are walking around today singing songs in their head right now that are going over and over and over in their heads. They're hearing a flyway that somebody said something and they're repeating that. So when we get this kind of information, that there ought to be a gathering where you call we could have put 2,000 people here just from New Orleans of artists and culture bearers who could have heard this information, and you would have a cacophony of things that would start happening by virtue of the information being digested and understood in a way that they could manage to essentially be your megaphones and your microphones. So that's one of the ways that we manage to do it. We use the places where people already are. We don't say, we got an important thing for you to come in here. We go and see where the people are and say, just like Colette said, this is something important I want you to hear. And what do you think about it? How does it fit for you? It's not hard. I mean, indigenous people have been sitting together, eating together, and solving problems for humanity from the beginning of time. That's how we got here. And in our learning more, we forgot some of the cultural ways of being as humans. And like I said, we are cultural before we get to be smart, before we get to be some of the other things that we aspire to be. And so we've got to get back to the roles, rules, rituals, traditions, and folkways that made it possible for people to look eye to eye and to understand how it is that you essentially engage and bring people forward. I have to underscore, though, that we're talking about things that have the potential for happening in years when people are looking at disasters that could happen on Friday if they don't get the money they need in the check to be able to take care of their families. And so the tension of that has to be handled inside of the movement to talk about land loss. That we've got to be talking about how that has something to do with their existence today. Maslow was not crazy. You cannot have people trying to actualize and to deal with these aspirational things when they're not able to deal with food, clothing, and shelter, security, and belonging. You can't get to the other stuff until you've taken care of that. And inside of that process, of course, is healing. So it's really critical for us to find people where they are and not call them to the mountain. This is a Mountain of Muhammad moment.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm a teacher when it comes to that. You know, whether they're on the boat and I have the depth finder on with the GPS, and the whole day they're on top of what used to be land. So they can look at the GPS and, God, we're running on top of land that's 4 foot deep. So I teach them that. But I use another analogy. And think about this. Delaware, Rhode Island, those are small states. The Grand Canyon is 1,906 square miles. We've lost 2,000 square miles. We've lost an area greater than the Grand Canyon. So when you put it in that, it paints a different analogy. We have to get away from Delaware because they think our problem is small. Our problem is huge. It's the worst environmental disaster in North America, and people don't know about it. When they come and fish, they say, how doesn't everybody know about that? But there's no difference between a mile of rainforest that everybody is yelling and screaming out or a mile of marshland in Louisiana, because it all takes in carbon, it all gives out oxygen, and when we lose it, that black water shines right back up and it adds to global warming. We have something for everyone, no matter what you believe, but we have to get our message out, and we're not doing it. We're not doing a good job of getting that message out. So I preach to the choir and to everybody I can find I talk to about. And you know, it's a shame because everyone knows what we have to do, and there's a few special interest groups that fight it. I just don't understand how you can stand in front of what we're trying to do.
I want to go ahead. Sure.
I forgot to mention this in answer to your question. When I was in Colorado, they were having trouble with water. There was a whole curriculum that all of the schools had about water. And so the kids were learning it in school, and it was the way people lived, right? And so this is a life and death matter. And so one of the places that we really need to make certain that it's not up to the decision of a given teacher, but that it's being taught, is that this is being taught as a major component in schools for all kids, regardless of whether you're in charter, public, parochial, or private, that this is what you have to do to be being educated in Louisiana. And that's one of the ways that, again, we arm our children with the information so that their brilliance can help us to be able to make decisions about what to do about it.
Yeah, I want to tie Jonathan into that because Jonathan works closely, just as you do, with so many of the young people. How do you get them to?
Well, sure. On a positive note, there are a group of folks working with the Louisiana Department of Education to try to make sure that that gets put into the curriculum. So at the Discovery Center, we have been developing a curriculum, K through 12. Well, once you get into high school, it's more the environmental ed side of things. But that will be taught, hopefully, will be a part of the science curriculum. With that said, two things, and it's sort of maybe a question even out to the audience. And one is, how do we make this a priority? First of all, we talked about, the folks from Colorado who have the issues with water and it's being taught there. So why do the folks in Colorado who have their issues, how do we get them to care about our issues? And we said we're not doing a good job about getting the message out, but there's a lot of stuff going on out there. And so how do we get those people to make this a priority of theirs when they don't feel as connected to it? And then beyond that, how do we even get our own people to make this a priority? And we talked about meeting people where they are, and we do that with the Discovery Center. We make an effort to do that, to try to get to mobilize the core group of people that are the movers and shakers in Chauvin, pulling those folks together, and then we say, okay, we're gonna have food because everybody likes to come around food. So we're gonna have food. We're gonna talk about all this. Let's pick the date, and then ultimately, like, oh, but that, I have my grandkid's birthday party this weekend, so I have to do that. And so it was a challenge. So it's not a priority. It's not seen as a priority. So I guess that's my question is, how do we get people when it's not an immediate, like you said, it's not, they're worrying about the disaster that happens on Friday. It's hard to look at that long-term thing, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How do we get people to be in this room?
Yeah, I think that the work has to be done on our side to essentially really show what we are supposed to understand, which is that there are connections between what's going on in Colorado and here. And so having them be concerned about us is harder than having them to be concerned, see how what's going on here is connected to what's going on there. And so I think sometimes it's like, don't you see me here? I'm drowning. And so folks are saying, well, I am too. And so, like, what do you want me to do, right? So it's about how do we manage to have both of these drownings be connected and to have an ability to have people see that they're working together, that perhaps the drownings would not be happening. And so I think often what happens is when we learn a bigger truth, we learn a bigger story, a bigger knowledge, that we feel like the knowledge in and of itself is going to be staggering and that people are going to essentially, and it's kind of like, okay, I can put this together with the cancer-causing things that are going on, with what's going on in terms of the violence against my children that's going on with the fact that I don't have a job, et cetera. So we've got to find ways to weave these things together and not try to hold them up as the cause celeb, the most important thing. You know, you've got people walking around wounded, like the walking wounded, that's Dr. Denise talks about, you know, who are doing their best just to keep their heads above a spiritual water because it's so hard for them. We can't think that this, you know, provocative and very compelling story is going to essentially get through that. And so we've got to find ways to connect people, their lives to this story so that people then feel like it's an important thing.
Colette, if you don't mind saying that quote about my liberation is tied to yours or whatever it is that you said, because I think that that's the quote. But then how do we get people to understand that their liberation is tied into ours? And can you yell it for us? Are you on the microphone?
Put it on the mic. Let's
sit on the microphone.
She don't need it.
Okay. Okay, thanks. This is it's a proverb from the Aboriginal people in Australia. And it says, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because you understand that your liberation is shared with mine, then let us work together. And that's from the Aboriginal people in Australia.
Thank you. So how do we do that?
What?
Morgan might have an answer. Great, thanks, Morgan.
Jimmy, if you will.
Yeah, sure.
The way to get to this is everyone asks, what's in it for me? Why should I care what happens in Louisiana? Because historically we have, all they know about us is bad politics and a bunch of guys that live off the land. You have to ask, what's in it for me? How's it going to affect me? Whether or not I'm not going to have ships coming up the river anymore if we don't have the river flowing. Take something as easy as ducks, you know, because what I do, I have access to every magazine and every TV show that has a fisherman or a hunter on it. And that's how I spread the message. But if you look at just ducks, for instance, we've lost 2,000 square miles of land, but we've lost 10,000 square miles of habitat. You know, ducks don't eat land, they eat grass. And without that aquatic vegetation, we've lost it 100 miles in. So if the ducks come down here, they look around, there's nothing to eat, well, guess what? They got to go somewhere. And if we don't have enough food hours to maintain those ducks, well, then they can't go back and reproduce. And sooner or later, that's important to everyone from Canada to Mexico. And that's how you get to them one subject at a time, look what they're interested in, and go with that. Without our oil and gas, what are we? Without our river, what are we? Without our seafood, what are we? Everybody likes something. You have to go after that thing that they like.
Thank you, Captain. I'd like to bring in Dr. Denise again a little bit and talk a little bit about the inequities in communities, especially when you're dealing with more and more flooding events, and how that exacerbates some of those inequities.
Well, we can look at Katrina and see what happened. For people who are in planning, I think the evidence globally is that people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged have the highest disaster risk. Yet when we are making our disaster plans, we do not think about these people. And then in the rescue, again, Katrina is another example, the inequity in the rescue. People were preferentially picked up when they were drowning, and we know what that was based on. And then just the recovery. We see the issues around housing and access to the new economy that comes when we are restoring an environment. But for me, of importance then, is what that does to the psyche, how that turns up for children who don't have access to schools that understand their traumas. They don't have access to health care with physicians who are compassionate enough to not give them the wrong diagnoses. What we're seeing in New Orleans now are children being disparately diagnosed with attention deficit disorder and behavioral disorders when they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And why that's important is the treatments are very different. In one, you basically give up and say there's something neurocognitively and you give them drugs. In PTSD, you say, oh, you experienced a really terrible trauma. It's impacted you. I am going to lessen the impact of that for you so that you can function again, find a new normal. And so there's so many ways that it turns up in our communities.
Chief, I saw you shaking your head a little bit. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, just to the comment, you know, everybody's focused on Katrina. Just last year, we had some traumatic events that happened. You can take Harvey, for instance, and people are still trying to relive, you know, get back to the normalcy there. And no one talks about Puerto Rico. Isn't that a United States land base? But yet these people, you know, they're not here, they're not spoken of, they're not thought of. Only small groups are still gathering things and sending it over there. You look at their infrastructure, totally destroyed, not by one hurricane, but by two. Two major Cat 5s that went through there and really demolished the infrastructure and the way of life and living that these people have. So when we start thinking about, you know, just our me, this happened to me, then you can't engage. And again, you walk in wounded. So how do you engage with Jonathan here to my left? When I'm looking at him, okay, he looks all right. He looks at me, I'm looking all right. But deep down, where it really counts at, he's dying. I'm dying. We're struggling, but we're smiling at each other. How you doing? I'm doing good. But we never really dabble into what is really affecting your well-being and what really caused that to happen. As you say, I know just in our community, we're looking at the dietary changes that our citizens are going through. And then this idea now, today is hurricane season for those of you that don't really know, just to remind you, it's here. So we're thinking now, we're not only thinking just of day-to-day living, now we're thinking, we went into whole survival mode. Now my thought pattern has dramatically changed from just everyday sustaining life. Now I'm really thinking, okay, well, if this comes here, I got to get this ready. These people have to get this. You have to educate our citizens. Let them know that if you evacuate, take the most important things and the values, that the things that you value most, because you may not come back to that area again, and it won't look the same. It won't be the same. You're not going to be the same. Then you're going to have to move, and you're going to have to relocate. So, I mean, all these things, when you start talking about, you know, what does the land change, and the captain on the end, he's been out there. I work out there in the bays. I work out there in the lakes. I travel, just like you say, by boat. I fly by plane, helicopter. And in Terrebonne Parish, when you go up, you look at the land. Everybody thinks you're surrounded by a lot of land. You'd be very scared as soon as that chopper clears the tree line and you see where the water's at. And when you bring people up there and they say, oh my God, they get it. But until you see it, feel it, live it, breathe it, you understand the understanding that you have. But once you see it, then you get that realization and the urgency of what is really happening to our area.
Chief, I want to ask you about, we'll get to some questions, but I want to ask you about Terrebonne specifically. You know, people in Terrebonne seem to be willing to levy taxes to protect their community. It doesn't seem to be that way in other surrounding parishes. What's the difference?
The difference is that we understand that if we are going to survive and exist, we have to tax ourselves. I know someone alluded to that earlier. We saw the need. Our parish officials saw the need. They came to the citizens, and holding these meetings where the people live is where it draws the attention. You go out there in the community, you say, if you want to live here, you have to help us help you. And when they understand that in order to thrive and survive and live and enjoy our way of life, we have to pay for it. I used to have a slide that showed the cavalry coming, and I tell people, I'm glad they're not, because anytime the cavalry comes to our culture, they wipe us out. So keep the cavalry, we'll take care of ourselves. Let us take care of us, and we'll do it. So even with the storms, you know, and going back to Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, Isidore, you know, you can go back to many hurricanes. We've had to pull ourselves up by our own bootstrap and rely on us and other people to help us to maintain the culture and the way of life that we have, and not relying on the government to come in, as you say, with FEMA or any of them, but realizing that we have to be self-sustaining and tax ourselves if we want to live in that community and thrive there and work there.
And this is for anybody, but you know, we're talking about hurricanes a lot, but it's just normal storms now. It's not hurricanes that necessarily, I mean, don't get me wrong, they're terrible things, but it's normal storms that are coming in and causing destruction.
Well, and just let me throw this little bitty can of oil that fell out there too. You know, it just happened to throw a little bit of that BP oil on us there. So we're just not going to throw that in there, because with all the other storms and other things, and then in the mix of all that, while you're recouping from Katrina, Rita, Gustav, and Ike, now you have an oil spill that comes in and decimates the way of life, because here it is, it came in at the worst time in April, and May is the opening season, as we know, for the brown shrimp. Our fishermen are really struggling through the winter time, so they're looking forward to this time to get fuel, to get ice, to get new nets, make grocery bill, get everything, get their boats painted, get everything, and incur a tremendous cost, and then just before they can go out to make money, they're told you can't go out. So, and that goes to back just what you're saying, you know, when you start realizing that all these has an impact on citizens and people and their moral outlook, and as you say, well, we have domestic abuse, we have abuses in alcohol, abuses in drugs, and you get that raw, you know, poisonous, and it just carries on from generation to generation, and from, you know, citizens to our younger people. And as she said, we're only borrowing the land from our youth, and if we don't take care of it now, then we're going to be held in a high immoral standard, because our youth, we will not be able to pass them nothing.
Please, hold it close, please. Here we go.
Yeah, Chef, Chief just stumbled on something that I was going to mention later, so I'm going to say it now. And it's really about the divine feminine. You know, we talk about land as motherland. We talk about the earth as motherland. And then we look at women, and we look at the earth, and we look at the value that women have, and we look at the value that the earth has. And when we talk about culture and we talk about art, we're right in on it. This is the spiritual issue that cannot be handled in science. It can't be handled inside of these concrete issues. They're handled in values and beliefs and ways in which people carry that along. Seeing is believing. We live in a city where you can walk down the streets in the quarter and look at a ship floating above your head, and you get clearly what that means in terms of living below sea level, and yet we do, right? And so it's this whole notion of kind of understanding that people will be inspired to do phenomenal things when the spirit and the will is encouraged to do that. And so Chief just talked about the shrimp not being gone, and that's the thing that brought this piece to me right now, is that if folks thought that they were not going to be able to do gumbo, I promise you that they would be upset. You know, and they would be terribly upset. You know, and so the issue of being able to connect to people is not always a logical one. Sometimes it's a cultural one. Sometimes it's a spiritual one. It's about the we-ness. It's about essentially, I'm a champion on this. And the reason I'm a champion is because it's going to affect me this way. But look, this is what's going to happen to you. You're not going to be able to buy shrimp, or they're going to cost so much that you're going to have to get, you know, fake shrimp. You know, and that could cause a riot in New Orleans. You know what I'm saying? And so that it is as simple as something as silly as that, but it's also a matter of that's how you create a weak conversation about something that is really so heavily rooted in knowledge of a certain kind, and not essentially connecting it to the other line of knowledge, which is the spiritual and the cultural knowledge, and how it is that people live and really expect to live going forward.
In our psyche, we always think of the hurricanes, because it's such a catastrophic event. But that's just a moment in time. The real slow cancer is the coastal erosion. And the reason the hurricanes are so violent and so destructive is because of the lack of our coast. So it's quite evident on the wall of my lodge. I have two lines. I have one at the height of the levee and one 4 foot higher from Katrina. The one 4 foot higher is 24 foot high. And if you take 6.3 miles of land that I lost on the west side of the Mississippi River, and it is said that for every mile of marsh you have between you and the Gulf, it knocks down the storm surge 1 foot. So if you do the math, it should have been 2.3 feet below the levee. I should have never got flooded. But because we lost that land, 67% of people no longer live there. And you take the industry, there's no more fruit trees. That was a major industry. Our oil industry is going down there. Everything's going, and it's going to creep its way forward. If we don't get a hold of our coast, New Orleans is going to be Buras in not too distant future. So we have to think about the coastal erosion. We don't have to think about the catastrophes, because the catastrophe was caused by coastal erosion.
Anybody in the audience? Yes, sir. Eli. Did y'all hear that tourism aspect of it? How to fold it in? You got it, Jonathan? Chief?
Yeah.
Put him on the spot there, Eli.
Yeah. The first part of it is that, you know, folks who are coming here often organize around hurricanes. They don't want to be here during that period of time that they think that active hurricanes can happen. So we lose, a lot of the major conferences will make a choice not to be here during that time. I think it's about storytelling. I mean, the shortest distance between two people, as my sister friend Liz Medicine Crow says is a story. And so it's building the story of our life here in Louisiana, what it has been, what it is, and what it could be, and how, and discovering what are the ways that we'd like people who visit here to make a difference. And so it's about us being creative about what we want to ask them to do. They're here, what we want to ask them to do. And the tourism industry is about just that, bringing tourists here. What they do when they get here is something that we can have a hand in doing. And so we got to figure out what it is. What's the story that we want to tell, and what is the action that we're wanting to ask from them as they come here and love this place and can't wait to get back to it. And so that's what I think that we could do there. And then it becomes almost like a kind of a project in terms of building that awareness, that story, the places and the ways in which people are going to be able to relate here. I don't know where all of the exhibits, to always have some major exhibit up that is dynamite that helps people to understand. Like when I went to the Smithsonian Native American Museum, because I couldn't get into the African American Museum. I wanted to see both of them. I only saw one. But there's a fabulous film there that kind of tells you the story of Native Americans and how it is that they've been affected. And so, we just need to have, we need to build into the tourism industry something that tells our story, carries the advocacy, carries the way in which we connect ourselves to the rest of not just the country, but the world.
What about the advent of ecotourism? It's becoming more and more a thing for people like Lost Lands Tours. Bob Marshall and his wife, they do these kayaking trips of people that come from all over the place, and they're teaching them. Before they go out in the kayak, first of all, they have a 45-minute presentation on land laws, which is something that would be really interesting to start doing more of.
Well, what we do, it's not hunting and fishing, it's entertainment. My industry is the entertainment industry. And we bring people in, and we're doing a good job. We're known as the #1 fishery in North America now. But it's not about letting people know, it's what can you do? What can you do to help to make it change? And realistically, the only thing they can do is pick up that phone and call the representatives as they support Louisiana in whatever bill that comes up to help this. Because other than that, there's not a whole lot that they can do if you're honest about it. But people are afraid to do that, to write a letter to the Corps of Engineers to get involved in these things. And the reality of it, if you ever go to Washington, you ever go to your councilman, your senator's office, there's a young person sitting there, an intern, and he's answering the phone, he's got a computer. Yes, Mr. Lambert. Okay, what side of this are you on? Okay, I'm going to type it up. And now you're a number, you're a percentage. You don't have to know all the details about what you're calling about. You don't have to be an expert. You're just giving your thought in which side of it you're on, and that's how policy is made, unfortunately. So it's so important that you don't be afraid to make that phone call and be in that number.
John.
That's what makes it happen.
When we work with our students, we have to be very sensitive that we don't create a lot of anxiety with the information that we give to them. We don't teach the kids to stay, and we don't teach the kids to leave. We just give them the information so that they have that, and they make their own decisions for themselves as they get older. With that said, one of the things that I enjoy working with these students with is that they are innovative, and they do think outside of the box, and they do think about what a prosperous future in coastal Louisiana looks like. And it does have a lot to do with ecotourism. That comes up a lot in their conversations with kayaking tours down the bayous in Terrebonne Parish. And there's also voluntourism, with trying to get volunteers in to do some of the plantings that we need to restore the coast. But it's so easy to get wallowed down with all of the negative things that we have to deal with in everything that you've learned at this conference. And I think the challenge lies in finding that silver lining, and we try to do our best with the kids so that they do have this sense of hope for what their future looks like. And it could be great. Like, we have to believe that it could be really great. And we can, and they're going to be able to make that happen.
We have about 5 more minutes. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
Off the top of my head, people working collectively work like people who work singularly, self-interest. And so I go back to the things that Colette talked about. You know, if you've got a, Chief talked about the fact that they don't have trouble getting taxes passed because folks get it, that they got to take care of themselves. So they work collectively to assert their political will to be able to manage to do that. And so I think that if the environment is charged with people who are in charge of their community, then a lot of what it is that private sector folks want to do rely on being able to be allowed to do it in certain ways and in certain places by the public sector. And so it goes back again to becoming an animated citizenry, to be involved and essentially letting the people that you hire as elected officials understand that you will send them home to their families if they don't manage to take care of the business that you want them to take care of. And so self-interest for the private sector is like self-interest for the person. Figuring out what is the story that makes the private sector get it, that there is something for them to lose if they're not cooperative in whatever the game plan is for your community. That's the only thing that I could think of.
We have time for about one more question. Yes, sir, Bill.
Everything I've heard, read, from experts about immersion the last couple of years, like an obvious they're the most powerful tool in food. As Captain Lambert, I understand there's still people out there who are opposed to it. How do we overcome that perception?
There are, and a lot of people listen to propaganda to say, okay, the diversions are going to ruin this, they're going to ruin that. If you look at where the crab traps are, for instance, they're in fresh water. Everywhere you look, down the river, in the passes, there's crab traps. So crabs out of it. All right, okay, everybody says, well, it's going to kill all the shrimp. Well, this year, they've closed the shrimp dock down twice already because they can't handle all the shrimp. The river was at 17 foot. On the east side of the river, there's 500,000 cubic feet per second at 13 feet at the New Orleans gauge, so it's running 500,000 cubic feet per second. And what do we do? There's 3 shrimp docks, open up a channel because the shrimp boats can't go on that side. So why would you want to go on that side if all that river water is poison? But he said, if we don't open it up, we could close our doors. But yet, there's still shrimpers that are protesting the diversions because someone told them to. It's not fact. You have to go fact, because why are there 50,000 shrimp boats out in Breton Sound, and here we are saying that 75,000 cubic feet per second in Barataria Bay is going to ruin the shrimping? It's all fictitious, and then people are afraid to change, but yet they're changing every day. But it's that slow cancer. It's not a drastic change where you're going to have to make an adjustment. You've grown up in it, and you moved. You're shrimping more and more inside, or you're crabbing, or whatever. Everybody's going to have to take and change according to this if we're going to survive in Louisiana. Diversions grow land. On the east side of Mississippi where I'm at, all those diversions, I've had to move my duck blinds further out and further out and further out. Where I used to put my signs or my blinds, I can't even get to it because it's complete land and grown up. You can't even see where it used to be. So they say don't invest in land because they're not growing anymore. We're growing it. And it can be done, and it can be done so easily. I mean, we're talking about growing thousands of acres with 2,000 cubic feet per second. If we take and put these diversions in and manipulate them to grow land more expedient, we can save a vast amount of Louisiana and the culture in which we have. That's why people come here, because of our people, our culture, our friendliness, our food. That's why people want to come here, because of what we are. And that's the message we need to get out. And diversions are the most cost-efficient way of doing that. And the only way to learn that is come and do it. Come get in a boat with me. Just, I'll take you out and I'll show you how it works. It's like night and day. When you go on the east side of the river where there's diversions, there is plant and animal life and birds everywhere you look. You go on the west side, there's a brown pelican, a seagull in open water. And it used to be just like that.
Thank you, Captain. Dr. Denise, how about a few closing thoughts for you? What would you like to leave our audience with?
I actually want to get back to the issue of youth. One of the most successful public health campaigns was in the 1980s against smoking. And young children were told, basically, if you smoke, you're going to die. And my children were then there, and if they saw anyone smoking, they thought we were all going to die, and we had to cover our faces. I know that scaring kids is not necessarily the best thing, but sometimes if you give them the fact and you let them know as much as they understand their mortality, they'll get dramatic, but they will do something. So no one around us could smoke. And so I just want to say that the hope really is with you all. It's your world. Make it what you need.
Thank you, Dr. Denise. Ms. Carroll. No. Why don't you finish up with some final? We're just about out of time. I was giving you an opportunity to wrap this one up.
The covenant also calls us to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I like to talk about the pursuit of happiness because when you get to the place where all you have to worry about is pursuing your happiness, that it feels like you ought to be in a pretty good place. And I think that Louisiana, for all of its ups and downs, is a place where folks are able to live inside of disaster, tragedy, successive tragedy, and trauma, and still want to pursue happiness. I think that's worth fighting for because there aren't a lot of places that are like that. That's why folks don't go back to Kansas and some other places, and they choose to come to Louisiana, right? And I just encourage us, again, to understand that if this rising tide is not going to lift all of the boats, then it's not going to work. And so we really have to figure out how it is that we're going to grow land and take care of everybody. And then not just the folks who are smart enough to know that they're dangerous, not just the folks who've got enough money to be able to manipulate their lives in the ways that they want to. Everybody who wants to pursue their happiness here, who wants to make the decision, take their chances on living and dying in Louisiana rather than in Kansas. That this work is about all of us here in Louisiana and how we relate not just to the rest of America, but the world. And our job is to build the storylines between us and all of the rest of them so that we become a big we.
Thank you. Chief.
Thank you. I like to just a little spin on the doctor's deal. Let's not scare them to death. Let's scare them to life. Let them realize that Scare them to life, because then that way there, you gain and you keep them with us. One of the things you're looking at, you know, we sit up here and we're talking about it, and realizing that I had the opportunity to go to the COP21 and find an organization, Gulf Coast Rising. We went there, and you realize that in going there, that your struggles was not only in the Gulf South, but it was the global South. So when you realize that you're not alone in your struggle, and the word that a lot of people forget to use is interoperability. Reach out. I'm going to touch him because he's in my new, I know Jonathan well enough to do that. Is that reach out. Find out his struggles. And the storytelling is sharing your struggles with the next person. Realizing that in the community you live in, if Jonathan falls out of it, we've lost a valuable asset to that community. So anyone in a community that if you fall out of it or you leave them out of it, then you're slowly but surely killing your own self. Either we all make it or none of us will make it. So if one life is important, I know they divert highways, they divert land development for a spotted owl. But yet they won't put the same value on one person's life. It's easy to move a whole community, then incorporate that community into the project. So with that, I want to leave you with that, is knowing that each and every one of us, even the young people, are very important to this struggle. As they say, we're getting along in age. I don't want to say old, but we're getting along in this. And if we can be of any assistant to your education, furthering your education, talk to us, ask us. I know sometimes I'm kind of hard to understand sometimes and reason with, but when it's all said and done, it's all about understanding our young people and giving them the tools that they don't have to go and take the pickaxe and dig, where they can get a excavator or they can get something modernized and move a lot more earth and use a lot more tools to their benefit than what we did. Technology, awesome. I wish I knew a lot more of it. I'm just like the captain. I just look at it, realize it's there, don't really fully understand it, but I appreciate it because I'm able to reach out to the world, where when we were on the boat, if you remember, we had to call the marine operator and everybody heard your calls. This way here I can call direct now. But in saying that, I want to thank everyone